Section 1. The World Before the War, a Civilization That Never Was. There is something quietly unsettling about the Fallout universe before a single bomb has fallen. You catch glimpses of it in pre-war newspapers yellowing on irradiated floors, in propaganda posters still clinging to crumbling walls, in cheerful holotape recordings made by people who had absolutely no idea that they were living in the final hours of everything they'd ever known. The world of Fallout isn't our world, and that gap between what it is and what it almost resembles is one of the most fascinating things about the entire franchise. It is a retro future frozen somewhere in the amber of 1950s, American optimism, a timeline that branched away from ours at some point in the mid-20th century and never looked back. The specifics of that divergence are deliberately kept vague by the game's creators, and the vagueness itself is part of the point. Some fans have spent years piecing together exactly when the Fallout universe and our own parted ways, and the general consensus settles around the early 1950s, roughly around the time the transistor was invented in our world. In Fallout's alternate history, the transistor never happened, or at least never became the dominant technology it became here. Computers are enormous. Televisions glow in warm, rounded cathode shapes. Cars run on atomic power and have that wide, chrome-trimmed, tail-finned silhouette of a 1950s American dream. Nuclear energy didn't just survive in this world, it became the answer to everything. It powered the stoves, the cars, the cities. It was sold on billboards with smiling families. It was the future, and everyone was told the future was here. What that means on a deeper level is that the entire technological trajectory of the Fallout world was different. Without microprocessors, without the Silicon Revolution, the world kept building bigger and louder machines. The Pip-Boy that the player character wears on their wrist is a perfect example. That chunky, analog, oversized device is essentially a nuclear-era dream of what a personal computer might look like if computing power came from valves and cathode tubes rather than etched silicon. It was designed by a civilization that imagined the future in chrome and atoms, not in glass and invisible light. Every terminal in the game runs on a green screen interface that would have looked at home in a 1960s government office, because in the Fallout timeline, that interface never became obsolete. The pre-war United States in the Fallout universe is recognizable enough to give you a sense of familiarity and different enough to feel genuinely alien. There were still states, still a federal government, still a president, but the country was also deeply, structurally authoritarian in ways that are shown through the propaganda you find scattered across the wasteland. The United States in this world didn't just wage wars, it sold them. Every conflict, every military campaign, every act of national violence was packaged into a kind of cheerful, all-American marketing campaign. You can find wartime newspapers calling for patriotism with the same breathless enthusiasm a modern company might use to advertise a sale. There are holotapes of people genuinely excited about the war. Children's shows, cereal boxes, Nuka-Cola advertisements, all of them reinforcing the idea that the nation was righteous, its enemies were monstrous, and its technology was glorious. That last part is key. The technology was glorious, and it was also catastrophic, and the people who built it knew exactly what they were doing. The resource wars, as Fallout's lore calls them, began somewhere around 2052. The world was running out of oil. The European Commonwealth went to war in the Middle East. The United Nations collapsed in 2052 as international cooperation crumbled under the weight of competition for what little remained. The United States annexed Canada in 2076, a move that sparked riots and resistance that the American government suppressed with the same brisk efficiency it applied to everything else. China, meanwhile, invaded Alaska in an attempt to seize the oil reserves there. The Anchorage campaign, which Fallout 3's Operation Anchorage DLC lets you experience in the form of a virtual reality simulation, became a defining symbol of American military capability, though the victory was Pyrrhic at best. By 2077, the world was so exhausted by decades of resource conflict that the idea of nuclear war had essentially become background noise. People knew it was possible. They knew Vault-Tec had been building Fallout shelters since the 2050s. They carried on. They drank Nuka-Cola, they watched television, they went to work, and on the 23rd of October 2077, at 9:13 in the morning, the first nuclear missiles arrived, and within 2 hours, the civilization that had taken centuries to build was reduced to ash and radioactive glass. What makes the Fallout universe so rich as a setting for theories and exploration is that the pre-war world was never just a backdrop. It was a character in itself, one whose decisions and secrets and buried sins cascade forward through 200 years of radiated wasteland and still shape everything the player encounters. Every vault, every faction, every ruined city is a direct consequence of choices made by people who lived comfortable lives in a world of chrome and atomic optimism. The shadow of what they built, literally and figuratively, falls across every piece of land the player walks on. And that shadow starts with one of the most deliberately concealed institutions in the franchise's history. The relationship between the pre-war government and the corporations that surrounded it is one of the most layered aspects of Fallout's world-building. Vault-Tec didn't build its shelters out of altruism. West-Tec didn't develop the forced evolutionary virus out of humanitarian concern. Robco Industries didn't flood the world with Protectron robots and Pip-Boys because it cared about people. These were companies in bed with a government that had long since decided that the survival of the American ideal mattered more than the survival of American people, and the experiments run inside the vaults are the clearest proof of that arrangement. The vaults were never really about saving people, but we'll get to that. The other thing worth sitting with before we move any deeper into the lore is the aesthetic of the Fallout world, because it's one of the most carefully constructed and thematically meaningful visual languages in gaming history. The retro-futurism of Fallout isn't just a style choice, it's a form of irony that runs through every pixel of the game's design. That gleaming, optimistic, mid-century aesthetic is pressed against the reality of a scorched, irradiated, post-human landscape, and the contrast between those two things is where the franchise lives. When you walk through a ruined diner and find a pre-war menu still pinned to the wall, advertising a Nuka-Cola and a slice of pie for 15 cents, that gap between the cheerful past and the horrifying present is exactly what Fallout is about. It's about what happens when the promises a civilization makes to itself turn out to be hollow. It's about the distance between what people were told and what was actually true. And what was actually true, as the lore slowly reveals, was darker than almost anyone living in that pre-war world could have imagined. The vaults weren't shelters. The government wasn't protecting its citizens. The corporations weren't developing technology for anyone's benefit but their own. The entire edifice of American optimism in the Fallout universe was constructed on a foundation of deliberate, systematic dishonesty. 200 years later, the wasteland is the result. There is a very specific kind of melancholy that the best Fallout games achieve, and it comes directly from this. Walking through a ruined neighborhood in the capital wasteland, or picking through the bleached bones of the old world in the Mojave, or stepping carefully around the shattered suburbs of the Commonwealth, you are always walking through the evidence of a civilization that believed its own mythology right up until the moment the sky turned to fire. The pre-war world wasn't evil because its people were evil. It was evil because its institutions were, and those institutions were very good at making their evil look like progress. That is the emotional core of Fallout. Everything else, every theory, every Easter egg, every piece of lore grows out of that understanding. And now that we have that foundation in place, we can start pulling on the threads that make the wasteland so endlessly interesting to explore, even for people who have spent hundreds of hours in it. Starting with the most elaborate, most deliberately cruel infrastructure project in the history of fictional America. Hey, wherever you're watching this from right now, whether it's late at night with the lights off or early morning with a cup of something warm, drop a comment with your location and the time. And if this is the kind of content you like to fall asleep to, subscribing means you'll always have something waiting for you. Section 2. Vault-Tec's Darkest Secrets. The shelters that weren't. When you first learn that the vaults were social experiments, it lands with a particular kind of weight because it reframes everything you thought you understood about the world you're exploring. Those cheerful blue and yellow signs, those smiling Vault Boy mascots, that perky advertising jingle, all of it was a front for something that the people running Vault-Tec understood very clearly and never planned to disclose. The vaults were not bomb shelters. They were laboratories, and the residents were the test subjects. This wasn't a secret kept from everyone. The Enclave, that shadow government running strings behind the scenes of pre-war America, knew exactly what Vault-Tec was doing. Members of the government knew. The executives at Vault-Tec knew. The overseers assigned to each vault knew, because each one was given specific instructions about which experiment to run and how to run it. What nobody told the people who lined up to buy their vault spots was that survival was, at best, a secondary concern. The real purpose of the vaults was to gather data on human behavior under extreme duress, to test new technologies and pharmaceuticals, to run social engineering experiments, and to produce the kind of long-term psychological research that would be impossible to conduct in a functioning society. That required a captive population. It required people who had nowhere else to go. The sheer variety of vault experiments is something that becomes more disturbing the longer you spend with the lore, because each one reveals a different dimension of how completely Vault-Tec had thought through its program of human exploitation. Some vaults were testing physical limits, some were testing social ones, some were testing the boundaries of what people could be made to believe, and some were simply testing what happened when you gave desperate people no good options and watched them choose. Take Vault 11, which sits somewhere in the Mojave Desert and contains one of the most quietly devastating stories in the entire franchise. The experiment there was straightforward in its structure and profoundly cruel in its design. The residents were told, when the vault sealed, that one of them must be sacrificed every year. If the community failed to produce a sacrifice, the vault's automated systems would kill everyone inside. The residents were given no reason for this, no theological framework, no logical explanation. Just the demand and the threat. And so, year after year, they chose someone. They developed political systems around the choosing. They formed alliances and coalitions and factions, all organized around the central brutal fact that one person was going to die and the rest were going to live. Some vaults descended into anarchy. Vault 11 descended into something more methodical than that. It became a society organized entirely around ritual sacrifice, and it lasted for 75 years before only 5 people remained. Those 5 survivors finally refused. They reached the breaking point, standing in the chamber where the sacrifice was supposed to happen, looking at each other, and collectively deciding that they would rather die together than choose one more person to kill. And then the vault's automated system spoke to them. It told them the truth. The sacrifice had never been required. It had always been a test. It called the 5 survivors shining examples of humanity, which, given what they'd just spent 75 years doing, is one of the most grimly ironic compliments in the franchise's history. The vault then opened its armory to them, a reward for finally doing what the experiment was supposedly measuring, the refusal to participate in institutionalized murder. Nearly everyone who had ever lived in Vault 11 was dead. The few who remained carried decades of complicity, and the automated system called them exemplary. Vault 12 in Bakersfield, California, takes a different approach to cruelty. It doesn't perform a long social experiment. It simply fails in a very specific way that Vault-Tec designed deliberately. The vault door never fully sealed. Radiation leaked in from the moment it closed, slowly irradiating the population, turning them into ghouls over years of exposure. The residents who survived their ghoulification went on to found Necropolis, the city of ghouls encountered in the original Fallout game. The vault itself was essentially a slow radiation chamber, and the people inside had no idea that the seal they trusted with their lives had been intentionally compromised. Vault 21 in New Vegas takes almost a wry approach to experimentation by the standards of the program. All conflicts inside this vault were to be resolved by gambling. Any dispute, from resource allocation to interpersonal conflict to leadership decisions, went to the table. The resident who won the bet got their way. It's one of the less immediately deadly experiments, and the vault actually functioned reasonably well because of it, which probably made for interesting data. By the time the events of New Vegas take place, Vault 21 has been emptied out and converted into a hotel on the Strip, which in some strange way is the most natural possible continuation of a gambling-based society. Vault 81, encountered in Fallout 4, was designed to be a medical research facility in the worst possible sense. Residents were meant to be unwitting test subjects for experimental cures to every disease known to pre-war medicine. The drugs were supposed to be delivered through the vault's air and water supply without the residents' knowledge, and the data from their responses was supposed to generate medical breakthroughs. What actually happened is that the scientist assigned to run the program had a crisis of conscience, documented extensively in the vault's terminals. He sabotaged most of the research, redirected the experiments toward a mole rat population in the lower levels, and spent his career protecting the residents from the program they'd been enrolled in without consent. Vault 81 is one of the few functional, populated vaults the player finds, precisely because someone on the inside refused to do what Vault-Tec had designed it to do. The only experiment that slipped through was one involving the mole rats, which ended up carrying a mutation that can infect humans with a disease that gradually destroys their health. That disease shows up in a companion quest and is one of the more quietly horrifying consequences of the Vault program. Vault 75, under Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, represents perhaps the most nakedly evil of all the Vault experiments because its subjects were children. The Vault was officially a shelter for families, but its actual purpose was the refinement of human genetics through the selective culling of residents who didn't meet specific physical and cognitive benchmarks. Children were brought in, raised to a certain age, evaluated, and, if they were deemed unfit, eliminated. Those who passed continued to be trained, tested, pushed, and evaluated. The whole program reads like a eugenics experiment run with the bureaucratic efficiency of a corporation that had run out of ordinary moral constraints. The evidence of what happened there is scattered through the facility, written in the language of clinical assessment reports discussing the performance metrics of children. Vault 95, in the Commonwealth's rugged Central Territory, was designed with a cruelty so well disguised that it deserves its own consideration. The Vault was advertised to chem addicts as a recovery facility, a place where they could get clean and start fresh. What Vault-Tec actually planned was to supply them with an initial clean period, allow them to recover and rebuild some sense of stability and community, and then introduce a hidden cache of chems after 5 years. The point was to study whether people who had achieved sobriety could resist relapse when the substance was made available again. They could not. The Vault descended into chaos and violence, and the results presumably went into a file somewhere in Vault-Tec's records that no one in the post-war world would ever read. Vault 112, completed in 2074 and one of the last vaults finished before the bombs, takes the concept of experimentation in a direction that is almost science fiction in its ambition. The vault was placed under the oversight of Stanislaus Braun, who had been Vault-Tec's director of the Societal Preservation Program, and was the man actually responsible for designing the experiment parameters for most of the other vaults. For himself, Braun chose something elegant. The residents of Vault 112 were placed in reclining pods hooked up to a virtual reality system called Tranquility Lane. From the outside, the vault looks mostly empty. Its residents are all there, in their chairs, connected to a simulated 1950s suburb where Braun, under the identity of a little girl named Betty, has been running experiments on them for 2 centuries. By the time the player finds Vault 112 in Fallout 3, Braun has had 200 years to become genuinely, casually monstrous. The people of Tranquility Lane have been killed, revived, manipulated, terrorized, and experimented on in ways that would be impossible in the physical world, and they have no idea. They just know that sometimes bad things happen in their little neighborhood and that they can't leave. Vault 114, in Boston's Park Street Station, takes aim at social class rather than physical or psychological limits. The experiment there required that the vault be populated almost entirely with upper-class residents, with one of Vault-Tec's own employees inserted as the overseer, someone with no management experience and a deliberately abrasive personality. The point was to observe how people who had lived comfortable, privileged lives dealt with losing everything that made them comfortable and privileged. The answer, based on what you find in the vault, is not well. The Overseer's Terminal is a particularly entertaining read. What ties all of these experiments together and what makes Vault-Tec's program one of the most compelling pieces of world-building in the franchise is the way it reveals the true relationship between the pre-war government and its citizens. Every vault represents a different form of the same fundamental betrayal, the substitution of institutional interest for human welfare, wrapped in the comforting language of protection and preparation. The people who bought vault spots believed they were buying survival. They were buying a ticket into an experiment whose results they would never see, run by people who viewed their suffering as data. There is a theory within the Fallout community, supported by some pieces of in-game evidence, that Vault-Tec may have known not just that a nuclear war was likely, but that it was going to happen on a specific date. The scale and precision of the Vault program, the way the experiments were designed for specific conditions that only a nuclear aftermath would create, and the involvement of the Enclave in the program's oversight all suggest something beyond contingency planning. If Vault-Tec knew when the bombs were coming, then the people who bought vault spots weren't even being sold survival insurance. They were being sold a berth in an experiment that the sellers knew would launch on a specific date. The Amazon television series leans hard into this reading, and we'll discuss that in more detail later. For now, it's worth sitting with the implications, because they make every cheerful Vault-Tec advertisement you encounter in the games ring with a very different kind of irony. The experiments themselves, as horrifying as they are individually, also serve a narrative function in the games that goes beyond shock value. They are the mechanism through which Fallout introduces moral complexity into a post-apocalyptic setting that could easily have settled for simple survival stories. Every vault is an argument about human nature. Vault 11 asks what a community will sacrifice to preserve itself. Vault 95 asks whether recovery is permanent or conditional. Vault 75 asks what we will do to children in the name of a better future. Vault 112 asks what an unchecked sadist does with unlimited power over others. The answers are never comfortable, and they're never simple. And that's precisely why the Vault experiments remain one of the most discussed and theorized aspects of the entire franchise, 25 years after the first game introduced the concept. There are 122 known vaults in the Fallout universe, and the games have only given us detailed looks at a fraction of them. Every new game in the series reveals a few more experiments, a few more chambers full of old bones and terminal logs, and each one is a small, sealed story about what people were willing to do to other people in the name of science, or progress, or national security, or simple self-interest. Somewhere in the wasteland, there are probably vaults we'll never visit, with experiments we'll never learn about, and residents who died of things we'll never know. That open space in the lore is part of what makes theorizing about it so endlessly compelling. Section 3. The Mysterious Origins of the Institute Science Without Conscience. There is a particular kind of institutional arrogance that develops in isolated places, the kind that comes from being genuinely smarter than your surroundings, while being completely insulated from the consequences of your decisions. The Institute, the shadowy, technologically advanced faction lurking beneath the ruins of Cambridge, Massachusetts in Fallout 4, is probably the most complete expression of that arrogance in the entire franchise. They built things that no one else in the wasteland could imagine, and they were so convinced of their own superior purpose that they stopped thinking of the people above ground as people at all. The story of the Institute begins long before it was called the Institute. The Commonwealth Institute of Technology was a prestigious pre-war university in the Boston area, the Fallout universe's equivalent of MIT, and like its real-world counterpart, it was a place where extraordinarily intelligent people were doing extraordinarily ambitious work. In the years before the Great War, CIT maintained an underground research facility beneath its campus, housing an experimental nuclear reactor and housing some of the most advanced scientific projects the pre-war government had sponsored. When the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, the faculty and students who were below ground that day survived. The campus above them did not. Those survivors spent the first years after the war trying to make sense of their situation. They had expertise, equipment, and power, but they were surrounded by a city in ruins and a wasteland that was rapidly becoming dangerous in every direction. They made some early attempts to engage with the communities forming on the surface, but those interactions didn't go well, and the specifics of why depend on which version of events you're following. What's clear is that within a generation, the children of those original survivors had developed both a faction structure and a name, the Institute, and they had begun to build something that would define their purpose for the next 2 centuries. The first-generation synths were the earliest products of the Institute's ambitions, and by modern standards, they're primitive. Mechanical humanoids with basic artificial intelligence, capable of following instructions and navigating simple environments, but visibly and obviously non-human. They were work machines, initially, built to handle tasks on the surface that the Institute's residents couldn't or wouldn't do themselves. They sent them to scavenge for materials. They sent them to gather resources from the surrounding ruins. And in the early decades, they also tried using them as a kind of diplomatic outreach, sending synths to interact with surface communities in an attempt to build relationships. Those relationships collapsed, partly through mutual suspicion and partly through the nature of what the Institute was doing and what it wanted. The turning point that the lore keeps returning to is called the Broken Mask Incident, which occurred in 2229 in Diamond City, the major settlement built inside Fenway Park. A Gen 3 synth prototype, a machine so perfectly human in appearance that it had apparently passed as a person for some time, malfunctioned and went on a shooting spree, killing 4 people before Diamond City security brought it down. When the synth was revealed for what it was, the city's already fragile trust in the Institute shattered completely. From that point forward, Diamond City viewed the Institute with the same blend of terror and revulsion that most Commonwealth residents still feel by the time of Fallout 4's events. The Institute's response to the Broken Mask incident, and to the general breakdown of their relationship with the surface, wasn't to try to repair it. They retreated. They sealed themselves more completely behind their advanced technology and their sense of superior purpose, and they stopped thinking of their relationship with the surface as something that needed to be managed through any kind of good faith. What they did instead, increasingly over the following decades, was treat the surface as a resource pool. They needed materials. They sent synths to take them. They needed data. They ran experiments on communities that had no idea what was happening. They needed genetic material for their synth development program. They sent agents to abduct people. That synth development program is one of the most fascinating and morally complex pieces of lore in Fallout 4, and it runs through several distinct phases that illuminate how the Institute's thinking evolved over time. The Gen 1 and Gen 2 synths were mechanical platforms, sophisticated machines but obviously artificial. By the 2170s, the Institute had begun to recognize that their mechanical synths had fundamental limitations for the surface work they needed done, and they began exploring the possibility of organic synthetic beings, machines that were built from flesh and could pass undetected among the Commonwealth's population. The research that followed was conducted, as so much Institute research was, without any ethical framework that recognized the people involved as deserving of consideration. Institute scientists began abducting surface residents and using them in FEV experiments, attempting to develop synthetic organic material using a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus. They tracked the mutations they induced, monitored the results, tagged the subjects when the experiment was done, and discarded the bodies. This continued for years until they hit an obstacle they couldn't engineer around. The radiation-induced DNA damage in surface residents made the kind of stable, controllable organic synthesis they were pursuing impossible with existing subjects. The breakthrough came in 2227, when Institute agents located a pre-war Vault-Tec cryogenic facility, Vault 111, where a family had been frozen. The infant in that family, a baby named Sean, had been in cryogenic suspension since before the Great War, which meant his DNA was completely uncontaminated by post-war radiation. His genetic code was the clean baseline the Institute needed for their Gen 3 synth program. They sent the mercenary Conrad Kellogg to retrieve the baby, killing the infant's father in the process, and leaving the mother frozen in her pod. Sean, designated as the genetic template for an entirely new generation of synthetic beings, grew up inside the Institute and eventually became its director, known to everyone in the facility as Father. The Gen 3 synths that resulted from Sean's DNA are the Institute's greatest achievement and their most morally troubling creation. They are indistinguishable from humans by any external examination. They are grown from lab-cultivated biological material, born as adults with implanted memories and identities. They are, in almost every measurable physical sense, human beings. Whether they are human beings in any meaningful philosophical sense is the central question that Fallout 4 circles without ever fully answering, and the ambiguity is deliberate. Institute scientists themselves are divided. Alan Benet, a Gen 3 synth researcher, believes that synths may be sentient, and claims to have evidence that they dream. Sean, who created them, and who is in many ways their father, in both the technical and metaphorical sense, insists they are not truly conscious, and that their simulations of feeling are just that, simulations. The player is never given a definitive answer. The Railroad, the underground faction dedicated to helping synths escape from the Institute, treats them as people deserving of freedom. The Brotherhood of Steel treats them as dangerous machines that should be dismantled. The Institute treats them as property. The Minutemen don't have an institutional position on them at all. And the sole survivor, if they pursue the Institute's questline, eventually inherits leadership of the entire organization and must decide for themselves what the Institute's future looks like, including what they believe about the beings that the Institute created. There's a theory about the Institute's ultimate goal that goes beyond what's directly stated in the game, and it's one of the more compelling ones in the Fallout 4 community. The Institute's stated mission, as articulated by Sean and by the faction's internal communications, is the preservation of humanity through scientific advancement. The surface world, in their view, is irredeemably compromised by radiation, mutation, and the social chaos that followed the Great War. The Institute represents the true future of humanity, clean, rational, scientifically managed. But there are clues scattered through the Institute's terminals suggesting that their plan for the surface world is less passive than they present it to be. The Gen 3 infiltrators they've been sending to replace surface residents aren't just gathering information. They're systematically substituting themselves for the organic communities above. The Institute isn't just waiting for the surface world to fail. They're quietly accelerating it. Whether or not that reading is correct, what's undeniable is that the Institute represents something very specific in Fallout's thematic landscape. They are the inheritors of pre-war scientific arrogance, the direct institutional descendants of the Vault-Tec program and the FEV research, and the military-industrial complex that built the world that burned. They are what happens when brilliant people decide that their intelligence grants them the right to treat other lives as variables in an equation. And they are, in the most unsettling possible way, genuinely brilliant. The technology the Institute has developed by 2287, when Fallout 4 is set, is centuries ahead of anything on the surface. Their molecular relay, the teleporter that allows instantaneous travel to any mapped surface location, is the most advanced piece of technology in the post-war world. Their synths are biomechanical engineering on a scale that no other faction has come close to matching. They are extraordinary scientists, and they are, by almost any reasonable measure, monstrous. That combination is what makes them interesting as a faction rather than simply villainous. The Institute forces a genuine ethical question about what scientific progress is for and who gets to decide, and what happens when the people making those decisions have insulated themselves so thoroughly from accountability that they've simply stopped recognizing it as a concept that applies to them. The ruins of CIT above them, the university that once educated people for a world that no longer exists, are a quiet monument to what happens when institutions outlive their original purpose, and the people who inherited them mistake their own continuity for the good of humanity. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel's Hidden History from Mutineers to Knights. The Brotherhood of Steel is one of the constants of the Fallout franchise. They appear in every mainline game, they wear power armor, they speak in the compressed, formal language of an organization that takes itself very seriously and has been doing so for a very long time. But the Brotherhood of Steel, as it exists in the mid-23rd century, with its chapters and its elders and its paladins and its deeply territorial relationship with technology, is very far from what Roger Maxson had in mind when he made the decision that started everything. And understanding the gap between what Maxson intended and what the Brotherhood became is one of the most useful keys to understanding the franchise's ongoing exploration of how institutions preserve themselves at the cost of their original purpose. Roger Maxson was a captain in the United States Army, a graduate of Berkeley with degrees in sociology and psychology, which already tells you something about the kind of person he was. He was sent to the Mariposa military base in early 2077 to supervise and protect the research being conducted there. What he didn't know, when he arrived, was exactly what that research was. Mariposa was one of the primary sites for forced evolutionary virus experimentation, and the work being done there was being done on unwilling human subjects. The scientists at Mariposa were conducting experiments on people who had been brought in under various pretexts, exposing them to modified strains of FEV, documenting the mutations, and discarding the bodies when the experiment was complete. When Maxson found out, through a combination of his own investigation and the eventual breakdown of the lead scientist, Robert Spindell, who suffered a complete psychological collapse under the weight of what he'd been overseeing, he made a decision that would redefine the rest of his life. He ordered the interrogation of the research team. He ordered their execution when the interrogation confirmed the worst of what he'd suspected. He declared himself and his unit in desertion from the United States Army, formally seceding from the nation whose uniform he was wearing. He broadcast that secession over military channels, knowing that in a world barreling toward nuclear war, there was a real chance no one would do anything about it. 3 days after that broadcast, on the 23rd of October 2077, the bombs fell. The weeks that followed were brutal. Maxson organized the survivors of his unit, including their families, who had been sheltering at Mariposa, and led them on an overland march toward the Lost Hills bunker in Southern California. The march cost lives, including Maxon's wife, and when the ragged survivors arrived at Lost Hills, they were not an army. They were refugees who happened to have military training and access to a hardened facility. Over the following years, Maxon did what his sociology and psychology background had presumably given him some tools for. He built an institution. The ideology he constructed for the Brotherhood of Steel in those first years at Lost Hills reflects his specific experience at Mariposa. He had seen what happened when advanced technology was placed in the hands of people with no ethical framework, people who were accountable to no one, and who had decided that their research goals justified anything. The response he built was an organization dedicated to controlling technology, to preserving it without allowing it to be misused, to ensuring that the scientific disasters of the pre-war era could never be repeated. In its original formulation, under Maxon's personal leadership, the Brotherhood was also supposed to protect and help rebuild civilian communities. Maxon explicitly wanted the organization to be outward-facing, to serve the people of the wasteland, rather than simply hoard the resources of the old world. That vision lasted roughly until Maxon's death from cancer in 2135. He died at the age of 95 or so, having spent the better part of 6 decades building something he believed in, and he left it to a son who believed in it rather differently. Maxon II, a teenager during the Great War, had grown up inside the Brotherhood and inherited his father's position without inheriting his father's perspective on what the organization was for. Under Maxon II, the Brotherhood stopped recruiting outside its own membership families. It turned inward, becoming more concerned with its own preservation than with the wasteland around it. The ideology of protecting and preserving technology gradually shifted toward an ideology of hoarding and controlling it, of keeping advanced technology out of the hands of the unworthy, which in practice meant anyone who wasn't Brotherhood. By the time of the first Fallout game, set in 2161, the Brotherhood is already the organization that most players think of when they hear the name. Technologically superior, politically isolated, suspicious of outsiders, and primarily interested in maintaining its own position rather than actually helping the communities around it. There are individual members who push back against this, and there are chapters that interpret the Brotherhood's purpose differently, but the institutional trajectory from Maxon's original vision is clear. Elder Owen Lyons, who leads the Capital Wasteland chapter of the Brotherhood in Fallout 3, is the most prominent example of a Brotherhood leader who tried to recapture something of Maxon's original intent. Lyons was sent east to investigate the technological artifacts of the pre-war capital, and when he found the situation in the Capital Wasteland, he made what the other Brotherhood chapters considered a catastrophic decision. He redirected his chapter's mission toward protecting the local population rather than purely collecting technology. He took in civilians. He used Brotherhood resources to fight the super mutant threat. He positioned the chapter as a force for protection rather than acquisition. The result was that the other Brotherhood chapters essentially cut Lyons' chapter off. They stopped recognizing it as legitimate Brotherhood. They sent representatives who founded the Brotherhood Outcasts, a splinter faction that maintained the more traditionalist Brotherhood stance on technology collection and refused to participate in Lyons' humanitarian operations. The conflict between Lyons' vision and the traditionalist Brotherhood position plays out across Fallout 3 as a kind of internal argument about what the Brotherhood is actually supposed to be, and by the time Arthur Maxon, a descendant of the founder, takes command of the chapter in the years between Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, the chapter has resolved that argument by moving back toward the traditionalist model, bringing the outcasts back into the fold under a more orthodox Brotherhood ideology. There's a theory in the Fallout community that the Codex, the Brotherhood's foundational text, was deliberately written to allow for multiple contradictory interpretations, and that this ambiguity is what makes the Brotherhood such a durable institution. Roger Maxon encoded enough flexibility into the Brotherhood's founding ideology that different leaders could extract very different priorities from the same set of principles, which is also why the Brotherhood looks so different depending on which game and which chapter you're dealing with. The West Coast Brotherhood of Fallout and Fallout 2 is old, insular, and bureaucratic. The Capital Wasteland Brotherhood of Fallout 3 is actively militaristic and paternalistic. The Midwest Brotherhood of Fallout Tactics is expansionist and relatively tolerant of non-standard members. The Commonwealth Brotherhood of Fallout 4 is fanatical and technology-obsessed in ways that shade toward outright extremism under Elder Maxon's leadership. The Appalachian Brotherhood in Fallout 76 reached through satellite communications with Roger Maxson himself while he was still at Lost Hills, represents something closer to the original mission than any chapter that came after it, partly because it was founded by military veterans who hadn't yet had a generation of institutional drift to contend with. Elizabeth Taggarty, the ranger who established the Appalachian chapter, built it around the values Maxson transmitted to her directly: service, protection, and the controlled stewardship of dangerous technology. What happened to that chapter, and the way it ends, is one of the most quietly tragic pieces of lore in Fallout 76. What makes the Brotherhood interesting as a long-running narrative element is precisely the gap between what it says it is and what it actually does. Every chapter of the Brotherhood speaks the same language of preservation and protection, uses the same ranks and rituals and terminology, traces itself back to the same founding myth of Roger Maxson at Mariposa. But what those words mean in practice varies enormously depending on who's leading the chapter and what pressures the institution is under. The Brotherhood is an object lesson in how founding myths calcify into ideology, and how ideology can be used to justify almost anything if the institution's survival depends on it. It's also, in a very specific way, a mirror of the military-industrial complex it grew out of, preserving the forms and structures of the organization that built Mariposa while occasionally wrestling with the values that organization trampled on. Section 5. The Great War. Who really pushed the button? The 23rd of October, 2077. The date is stamped into the Fallout universe like a scar. It's the moment that defines everything. The division point between the world that was and the world that is, the line after which nothing that came before could be rebuilt. 2 hours. That's all it took. In 2 hours, the civilization that had spent centuries building itself was reduced to atoms and ash. And the three factions primarily responsible for the state of the post-war world, the United States government, China, and Vault-Tec, all had complicated relationships with what happened on that morning. The question of who fired first has been one of Fallout's most enduring mysteries, precisely because the games themselves have been deliberately coy about it. The evidence points in multiple directions, and the creators of the franchise have occasionally weighed in without making anything fully canonical, which means the question has remained alive and genuinely interesting, rather than being settled and filed away. The most straightforward reading, supported by in-game dialogue from characters like President Dick Richardson in Fallout 2, and by switchboard terminal entries in Fallout 4, is that China launched the first strike. The Sino-American War had been grinding toward a catastrophe for years. China had invaded Alaska. The United States had repelled that invasion with significant technological advantage, particularly in the form of power armor, and had then pushed toward the Chinese mainland in a campaign that suggested the U.S. military was prepared to fight until it won decisively. Chinese warships equipped with nuclear warheads had positioned themselves off the western coast of North America. The pressure on both sides had been building for years, and at some point in the morning of October 23rd, someone pressed the button. Tim Kaine, who co-created the original Fallout and was instrumental in establishing its lore, gave a more specific answer in a 2023 interview. His original vision was that China fired first, but that the reason China fired was a specific piece of information about what the United States had been doing. When China learned that the US had been developing the forced evolutionary virus, a biological weapon of enormous destructive potential, and had refused to stop or to be transparent about the program despite diplomatic pressure, that discovery became the immediate trigger for the nuclear exchange. In this reading, the Great War isn't simply a case of two powers pushing each other past the brink. It's a case of one power's secret biological weapons program being the straw that finally collapsed the possibility of restraint. But the Amazon television series, which is canonical to the franchise per Bethesda's Todd Howard, introduces a significantly different answer. Through Cooper Howard's experience in the days before the bombs fell, and through the revelation of what Vault-Tec's executives were planning, the show suggests that it was Vault-Tec itself that initiated the nuclear exchange. The implication is chilling, that a corporation with everything to gain from a nuclear war, a corporation that had spent decades building the infrastructure for an elaborate post-war research program, a corporation that had essentially pre-sold tickets to its own experiment, chose to trigger the apocalypse rather than waiting for it to happen naturally. The bombs were coming. Vault-Tec simply decided to control the timing. This reading retroactively transforms every Vault experiment into something even darker than it already was. If Vault-Tec didn't just prepare for the bombs but actually dropped them, then the people who bought vault spots weren't just misled about what the vaults were for. They were buying survival from the same organization that decided to end the world they were supposedly being sheltered from. The money they spent on their vault spots didn't just fund the experiments, it funded the bombs. The Vault-Tec theory had been circulating in the Fallout community for years before the television series, supported by a few pieces of in-game evidence that were easy to interpret in multiple ways. The sophistication and scale of the Vault program always suggested an unusual degree of confidence that the experiments would actually launch. Normal contingency planning doesn't require 122 vaults with individually designed experiments. That level of investment implies certainty rather than precaution. The Enclave's involvement in the Vault program, their pre-war preparations on the presidential oil rig and in various fortified locations, also suggests a timeline with a known endpoint rather than a hoped-for one. There's also the matter of Vault-Tec's relationship with the pre-war government, which was closer than any arm's-length contractor arrangement should have been. The Enclave exerted influence over Vault-Tec's operations according to the franchise's lore, and the Enclave was a faction that had, by their own admission, decided that nuclear war was inevitable and had structured their entire post-war plan around being the survivors who would rebuild America on their own terms. If the Enclave knew the war was coming, and if they had influence over Vault-Tec's timing, then the Vault program's launch timeline becomes something more troubling than coincidence. Jesse Heinig, a Fallout developer, offered a perspective on the who fired first question that shifts the frame entirely. His view, shared in a statement on the Modifius Entertainment Discord, was that the more interesting question isn't who launched the first missile, but rather what policy failures, what institutional corruptions, what patterns of jingoism and imperial overreach and willful blindness to consequences created the conditions in which destroying civilization seemed like anyone's best option. That reframing is both genuinely interesting and very consistent with what the franchise's best moments actually do, which is use the specific catastrophe of the Great War to say something about how institutional systems fail and how the people inside those systems convince themselves that the failure was justified. By that reading, the question of who fired first becomes almost irrelevant. The US, China, Vault-Tec, the Enclave, they all participated in building a world where nuclear annihilation was not just possible, but functionally inevitable, where every choice made by every institution was oriented around winning a conflict that no one could win, where the concept of global human welfare had been so thoroughly subordinated to national and corporate interest that the phrase could no longer have had any real meaning to the people who might have used it. The bombs fell because everything in the world was pointing at them for decades, and the particular nation or corporation or corporate government hybrid that happened to issue the first launch order is almost an administrative detail compared to the structural trajectory that made that order a matter of when, rather than if. Captain Zhao, the ghoul you encounter aboard the sunken Chinese submarine Yangtze off the coast of the Commonwealth in Fallout 4, is one of the most quietly poignant pieces of this puzzle. He has been underwater for 200 years, technically still at war with a country that doesn't exist anymore, waiting for orders that will never come. He fired his warheads on the morning of the 23rd of October 2077 at cities on the American East Coast. He didn't fire first, he was part of the exchange. But his presence in the game, the fact that he's sitting at the bottom of the harbor still technically on duty, is a small, specific version of what the Great War left behind. Not just ruins, not just radiation, but systems and institutions and individuals still running on the logic of a conflict that ended in 2 hours 2 centuries ago. Section 6. Easter eggs woven into the wasteland. The hidden layer. Every Fallout game has a surface layer. The story you play, the factions you join or destroy, the wasteland you explore. And then there's the layer underneath that, the one made of references and in-jokes and hidden tributes and quietly placed nods to other games, other films, other pieces of culture that the developers loved. That layer is enormous. It's one of the richest traditions in the franchise, and it goes back to the very first Fallout. The original Fallout, released in 1997, is liberally seasoned with references to films and books that influenced its creators. The Brotherhood of Steel's design draws from the Road Warrior and other post-apocalyptic cinema of the 1970s and 1980s. The Master, the villain of the first game, has a voice built partly on the influence of Peter Sellers' performance in Dr. Strangelove. The Vault Dweller's story has structural elements borrowed from A Boy and His Dog, a 1975 post-apocalyptic film based on Harlan Ellison's writing. The Fallout universe was assembled from a very specific collection of cultural influences, and finding those influences embedded in the games is like a form of literary archaeology. But it's in Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas where the Easter egg tradition really reaches its fullest expression, because both games are operating in relatively large open worlds, where the developers had room to plant things in places where only attentive players would find them. Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland is full of them. There's a ruined location containing a scene that perfectly recreates a famous moment from The Shining, with a child's ball in a long hallway and the door at the end. There's the Dunwich building, which contains a deliberately atmospheric series of events designed as a nod to H.P. Lovecraft's Dunwich Horror, complete with an inexplicable otherworldly presence and documents that hint at pre-war cult activity. There's the alien ship crash site called Recon Craft Theta, suggesting that the Zeta aliens of the Mothership Zeta DLC had been visiting Earth for some time before the events of the game. Fallout New Vegas, developed by Obsidian Entertainment in 18 months under intense time pressure, somehow managed to pack an even denser layer of references and hidden content into its world. Obsidian's creative team has always been willing to be open about what they were referencing, which means a lot of the Easter eggs in New Vegas come with attached development commentary. On the utility poles in Freeside, small plaques read TES 04, a direct reference to The Elder Scrolls IV, Oblivion, Bethesda's contemporary RPG. The number appears to be a quiet acknowledgement from Obsidian that they were working in a world that Bethesda now owned, placed where only observant players would notice it. The Old World Blues DLC, set in the surreal technology-saturated landscape of the Big Empty, is essentially one extended love letter to mid-century science fiction B-movies, from its dialogue to its setting to the way its characters think about science and progress. The Think Tank, a group of pre-war scientists whose brains have been transplanted into mobile platforms, are a direct parody of the kind of brilliant scientists gone wrong archetype that appeared in dozens of 1950s films. And their dialogue is full of references to that tradition. There's a creature named Stripe in the Old World Blues DLC, a tiny deathclaw living in the backyard of a house in Higgs Village, who is a direct reference to the Gremlins films. Fallout 4 contains a remarkable number of literary and cultural references embedded in its environment. The Dunwich Borer's Quarry continues the H.P. Lovecraft tradition established in Fallout 3, this time with a distinctly more elaborate underground sequence. The name Dunwich itself is taken directly from Lovecraft's Dunwich Horror. There's a location called the Parsons State Insane Asylum, and a questline associated with it involving a character named Edward Cabot, whose family has connections to pre-war occult research and whose sister is centuries old due to a mysterious artifact. That questline is one of the most quietly unsettling in the game, precisely because it doesn't fully explain itself. The Prydwen, the Brotherhood of Steel's massive airship in Fallout 4, takes its name from Welsh Arthurian mythology, specifically from the ship of King Arthur mentioned in the Welsh poem Prydw Anfan. The name choice for a vessel belonging to an organization that has adopted chivalric titles and ranks is clearly intentional. The Amazon television series Brotherhood airship is called the Caswennen, which in some Welsh sources is an alternate name for the same Arthurian ship, a detail that suggests the show's writers were paying close attention to the same reference material. In Starfield, Bethesda's space exploration RPG that came out in 2023, there's a cloning facility on the planet Charybdis III, where one of the cloning subjects is identified on a taped note as Gary, a direct reference to Vault 108 in Fallout 3, whose population was famously reduced to clones of a single individual who seemed to be capable of only saying his own name. The note also references 2277, the year Fallout 3 takes place. It's a self-aware nod from a studio that knows its own history. The Doom reboot of 2016 contains a Vault-Tec logo on a door on Mars and a collectible miniature Doom Guy figurine that mirrors the Vault Boy collectibles from the Fallout series. Bethesda, publishing both franchises, created the opportunity for cross-referential Easter eggs, and the team working on Doom clearly enjoyed planting them. But perhaps the most touching category of Easter eggs in the Fallout franchise isn't the pop culture references. It's the personal ones, the moments where developers left something small and specific in the world that was meaningful to them rather than to a franchise or a film. In Fallout 3, there's a memorial in a certain location to a real person who passed away during the game's development. In New Vegas, certain locations carry personal references from Obsidian writers that speak to experiences and relationships outside the game. These quiet personal Easter eggs are the hardest to find and the most human things in the wasteland. They're the places where the developers stopped thinking about marketing and just left something of themselves in the world they were building. The tradition of Fallout's Easter eggs is also, in a sense, a form of ongoing conversation between the franchise and its audience. The community that has grown up around Fallout is one of the most observant and detail-oriented in gaming, the kind of audience that notices when a utility pole in Freeside has an unusual number. Bethesda and Obsidian have both clearly been aware of this, and the Easter eggs have over time become more elaborate and more layered in response to a community that is capable of finding almost anything. The result is a feedback loop in which the games reward close attention at every level, from the macro narrative down to the individual pixel on a specific sign in a specific back alley of a ruined city. Section 7. The Courier's True Identity and New Vegas Mysteries. There are many things about the Courier that the game tells you, and many more that it deliberately leaves open. The player is a blank slate in most RPGs, but the Courier is a blank slate with history, with enemies, with a wound that should have killed them and didn't, and with a presence in the world that clearly extends far beyond the opening scene in Goodsprings. Piecing together who the Courier actually is, beneath the player's choices and the character sheet, is one of the most sustained and enjoyable exercises in close reading that Fallout New Vegas offers. The surface story is straightforward enough. The Courier is a professional delivery person working for the Mojave Express. In 2281, they're hired to carry the platinum chip from near Hub, California, to the New Vegas Strip, where it's intended for Robert House, the reclusive tech magnate who controls New Vegas through his network of Securitron robots. Benny, one of House's lieutenants who has developed his own ambitions, intercepts the Courier, shoots them twice in the head, and buries them in the Goodsprings Cemetery. Victor, a Securitron operating under House's remote direction, digs the Courier out. Doc Mitchell patches them up. The game begins. What that summary leaves out is everything that makes the Courier genuinely interesting as a character beyond their function as a player avatar. The first thing is the matter of who was originally supposed to deliver the platinum chip. According to Fallout New Vegas's Lonesome Road DLC, the delivery job was first offered to someone named Ulysses, a former frumentarius of Caesar's Legion turned wandering mercenary with a very specific personal history with the Courier. Ulysses pulled out of the job when he saw whose name was listed as the alternate Courier, which was the player character. Whatever history exists between Ulysses and the Courier, it was enough that Ulysses wanted nothing to do with a job that would require him to work alongside them, even indirectly. That history, pieced together through notes and holotapes across the 4 DLC expansions of New Vegas, involves the Divide, a region of the Mojave that was once an emerging settlement called Hopeville. The Courier had been through the Divide years before the events of the game, delivering packages for the Mojave Express. One of those packages contained an old military detonator, which the Courier delivered without knowing what it was. The detonator activated a network of dormant nuclear missiles buried beneath the Divide, which launched, leveled the settlement, and created the catastrophically unstable landscape that the Lonesome Road DLC takes place in. The people of Hopeville, a community that Ulysses had been part of and had believed in, were obliterated. Ulysses spent years afterward tracing who had delivered the detonator and why. When he found out it was the Courier, working blind for the Mojave Express, doing a job without understanding what was in the package, his feelings about that discovery were complicated. He didn't find someone who had destroyed Hopeville out of malice. He found someone who had done it by accident, in complete ignorance, doing a job. That's almost harder to deal with than deliberate destruction. You can hate a villain. You can't easily hate someone who killed your people while believing they were delivering a care package. The Lonesome Road DLC is a conversation between the Courier and Ulysses, conducted across a radioactive hellscape, about the nature of choice and consequence in a world where the two are often separated by years and by ignorance. It's the closest the game comes to giving the Courier a definitive backstory, and it manages to do so while still leaving enormous interpretive room. The Courier's reason for being in the Divide, their relationship with Ulysses before the destruction, their level of awareness about the package they were carrying, all of these remain at least partially open. The question of who shot the courier twice is a simpler mystery with a known answer, but it still generates discussion because the physical evidence is slightly ambiguous. Benny ordered and participated in the shooting in the Good Springs Cemetery. The game's intro scene shows the courier being shot and buried. Several NPCs in the game reference the two bullets specifically, and medical examination of the courier's skull in certain dialogue confirms that both shots were to the head. The theory that Ulysses was also involved, that he may have fired one of the shots as a kind of pre-game reckoning with the person who destroyed Hopeville, is an interesting community reading but isn't supported by the game's explicit lore. What is supported by the lore is that the courier surviving 2 point-blank gunshots to the skull is attributed by Dr. Mobius in the Old World Blues DLC to a bullet hitting a particular part of the brain in a way that caused unusual rather than immediately fatal damage. The courier is not invincible. They were just extremely implausibly lucky. Robert House's plan for New Vegas is one of the game's richest areas for theorizing, because House is one of the most unreliable narrators the franchise has produced. He is genuinely brilliant. He is demonstrably capable of feats of planning and execution that border on the superhuman. He anticipated the Great War by approximately a day, and saved New Vegas from direct nuclear impacts through a system of automated defense he designed years in advance. He's been directing his Securitrons remotely while kept alive in a life support pod for 2 centuries, and he presents himself consistently as the only person with a coherent plan for humanity's long-term future. His stated plan, as he explains to the courier over the course of the game's main questline, is to use the resources and stability of New Vegas to restart economic and industrial development in the Mojave region, eventually expanding to the point where civilization can be rebuilt on a scale that prevents the NCR and Caesar's Legion from being the dominant models going forward. The Platinum chip, which is the object everyone in the game is fighting over, contains software updates for the Securitron army stationed in the vault beneath Hoover Dam, upgrades that would give House the overwhelming military force to back up his political vision. What the game doesn't tell you directly is what House's 20-year plan for humanity actually involves, because House is deliberately opaque about the parts that might not play well. There are hints throughout his dialogue and his terminal records that his vision for the future involves a very specific kind of human civilization, one optimized for the production of the interstellar travel technology that he believes is humanity's only real long-term survival strategy. House thinks in centuries. He expected the Great War was coming 20 years before it happened. His plans for New Vegas are not an end goal. They're a first step in something much larger. The question of what that larger thing looks like, and whether it includes the kind of human freedom and autonomy that the NCR's democratic model claims to provide, is one that the game poses without answering. The Yes Man ending, in which the courier takes control of New Vegas for themselves, is the one path through the game that doesn't hand the Mojave to any existing institutional framework. It's also the ending that the game treats with the most ambiguity, because the end slides for the Yes Man path acknowledge the genuine possibility that an autocracy, even a benevolent one, might not be better than the messy democracy of the NCR or the ordered brutality of the Legion. The courier's independent New Vegas might thrive, or it might repeat the same mistakes as every power structure that came before it, just under new management. Section 8. Children of the Atom and Other Cults. Faith in the Wasteland. There is something logical, in a deeply unsettling way, about the children of the atom. Not logical in the sense of sensible, because drinking irradiated water as a religious sacrament and deliberately seeking exposure to radiation as a spiritual practice are not sensible things to do. But logical in the sense that if you were born into a world where nuclear weapons had remade every landscape, every body of water, every living thing, the leap from nuclear energy destroyed the old world to nuclear energy is, therefore, the fundamental creative force in the universe, is a smaller one than it might appear. Every religion is, in some way, an attempt to make meaning out of the most overwhelming forces a community encounters. In the Fallout Wasteland, radiation is one of the most overwhelming forces imaginable. The children of the atom made meaning out of it. The cult first appears in Fallout 3, gathered around an undetonated nuclear bomb sitting in the center of the town of Megaton. They worship the bomb. Their leader, Confessor Cromwell, stands in the shadow of this enormous unexploded device and delivers sermons about the glory of atom, the deity the cult believes is embodied in nuclear fission and the transformative power of radiation. His opening words in Fallout 3 are, "He is coming with the clouds," a deliberate echo of the language of Christian revelation, establishing immediately that the children of the atom have borrowed heavily from the structure and vocabulary of Christian liturgy and simply replaced its central symbol with a nuclear weapon. This is theologically interesting because it reveals something about how the children understand causality. In their theology, the Great War wasn't a catastrophe, it was a creation event. Atoms split the world, as the atom is split in a nuclear reaction, and from that splitting came the world that now exists. The radiation that kills so many wasteland inhabitants isn't a poison, it's a blessing. Ghoulification, the process by which severe radiation exposure transforms humans into long-lived but physically deteriorating ghouls, is understood by the most devoted children as a form of divine favor, a closer communion with Adam's transformative power. To become a glowing one, a ghoul so irradiated that they emit light, is to be especially touched by Adam's grace. The theological framework the children have built is remarkably internally consistent, which is part of what makes them interesting rather than simply absurd. The cosmology holds together. The ritual practices follow from the beliefs. The hierarchy of priests, confessors, and mothers echoes the structures of institutional religion in ways that give the group social coherence. And perhaps most importantly, the cult offers something that the wasteland is very short on: community, purpose, and an explanation for why the world is the way it is that doesn't require you to confront the possibility that it's just random, meaningless suffering. The community of people who find their way to the children of the atom is also illuminating. Many of them are ghouls, people who have already undergone the transformation that the cult treats as divine, and who have found in the children's theology a framework for understanding their own condition as something other than a curse. Others are people who have been marginalized or rejected by mainstream wasteland society, who have found in the children's radical theology a sense of belonging that they couldn't find anywhere else. The cult's willingness to take in people that other communities rejected is one of the most human things about it, even as its theology requires increasingly irrational practices. By the time of Fallout 4, the children of the atom have expanded beyond their original megaton location and split into two major communities. One group, led by Mother Isolde, has settled in the Glowing Sea, the catastrophically irradiated zone created by the direct nuclear impact on the area southwest of Boston. They've set up in the impact crater itself, the most radioactive spot in the Commonwealth, and they live in it without protection because the radiation is Adam's presence, and one does not flee the presence of one's God. The other group, led out of the Far Harbor region by Confessor Martin, settled near the island of Mount Desert in Maine, and eventually took over a decommissioned nuclear submarine base they call the Nucleus. Their presence on the island puts them in direct conflict with the human settlers of Far Harbor, and the Far Harbor DLC's central conflict is built around that tension. The Far Harbor version of the children is the most developed portrait of the cult in the entire franchise, and the DLC uses their presence to ask genuinely difficult questions about faith, radicalism, and what happens when a community's theological convictions lead it toward actions that harm others. Some children in the Nucleus are peaceful, genuinely spiritual people who have found meaning in their beliefs. Others have been radicalized into using their faith as a justification for violence against the communities around them. The DLC doesn't resolve this contradiction by declaring one version of the children correct. It shows both versions existing simultaneously, which is also, uncomfortably, how real religious communities tend to work. The children of the atom are clearly inspired by real-world religious traditions, filtered through a post-apocalyptic lens. The structure of the faith draws on Christianity. The theology of transformation through a specific form of energy has parallels in various esoteric and mystical traditions. The community-building function of the group, offering belonging to the marginalized in exchange for doctrinal commitment, is recognizable from the sociological study of new religious movements. The cult is also, in game design terms, a clever mechanism for exploring what theology looks like when it develops in response to a genuinely different set of historical conditions. In a world where nuclear weapons ended civilization, the question of how to make religious meaning out of that ending is a real one, and the children of the atom are one of the franchise's most sustained attempts to answer it. There are other religious and quasi-religious movements in the Fallout universe that are worth considering alongside the children. The Great Khans, though primarily a raider gang, have a mythology built around the idea of greatness and legacy that functions almost religiously. Caesar's legion, for all its Roman affectations, is built on a quasi-religious ideology of strength and civilization that Caesar himself has consciously constructed and that he understands as a tool for social cohesion rather than as genuine belief. The Brotherhood of Steel has elements of a religious order in its hierarchical structure, its veneration of technology, and its willingness to define outsiders as insufficiently worthy of membership. Even the Institute has a kind of secular religion built around the supremacy of science and the belief that they are humanity's true future. What the Fallout franchise does with all of these groups is treat religious and quasi-religious belief as a fundamental human response to conditions of extreme uncertainty and crisis. Every community in the wasteland has developed some form of ideology or mythology to explain why the world is the way it is and what their particular community's role in it should be. The children of the atom are the most overtly religious, but they're part of a broader pattern in which the absence of the pre-war government and institutional structures has created a vacuum that every group in the wasteland is filling with something, some story about who they are and why they matter. Section 9. Creatures of the Wasteland, the science behind the monsters. The wasteland is full of things that want to kill you, and most of them have a story behind them that goes beyond simple nuclear mutation. The Fallout universe's creatures are, in many cases, the products of deliberate scientific decisions made in the pre-war period, which means every Deathclaw attack and every super mutant ambush is in some way a consequence of institutional choices made by people who are long dead. The creatures of the wasteland are the biological legacy of the pre-war military-industrial complex, and understanding where they came from transforms them from obstacles into evidence. The forced evolutionary virus is the thread that connects most of the wasteland's most distinctive creatures. The FEV was originally developed by Vault-Tec Corporation's Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Weapons Division, initially as a response to a new disease that emerged in the pre-war United States, simply called the New Plague, and as a defense against China's own biological weapons programs. The research went through multiple stages and multiple facilities before settling into the Mariposa military base in Central California, where the Vault-Tec adjacent experiments that Roger Maxson would eventually discover were being conducted. The fundamental mechanism of the FEV is elegant in a genuinely terrifying way. It's a retrovirus, meaning it inserts its own genetic material into the cells of its host. But unlike most viruses, which are doing this to reproduce themselves, the FEV does it to force evolutionary change on the host's genome. It accelerates and exaggerates biological development in ways that are theoretically controllable but in practice highly variable. In a fully functional pre-war laboratory with complete experimental oversight, specific desired mutations could be targeted and achieved. Outside that controlled environment, the FEV produces something more chaotic. It pushes the host's biology toward an extreme version of itself, dramatically amplifying whatever characteristics are already present. The super mutants of the West Coast, created through the Masters program in the original Fallout, are the most direct product of the FEV in its most potent form. They are enormous, extraordinarily strong, highly resistant to radiation and disease, effectively immortal in terms of aging, and almost entirely infertile. That last trait is the Master's great tragedy, built into the biology of his new order of beings. He has created beings who cannot reproduce, which means the only way to make more super mutants is to continue converting humans, which is not a sustainable civilization. When the Vault Dweller presents this argument to the Master with sufficient intelligence and persuasion, he is convinced by the logic of his own failure, and his unity collapses. The East Coast super mutants of Fallout 3, found throughout the capital wasteland, and notably at their point of origin in Vault 87, are the product of a different FEV strain, one that was less refined and produced beings who are, on average, less intelligent and more aggressive than their West Coast counterparts. Vault 87 was another of Vault-Tec's experiments, one designed to test FEV on human subjects as part of a program called the Evolutionary Experimentation Program. The super mutants that resulted have been reproducing by converting human captives for over a century by the time of Fallout 3's events, and the Vault 87 strain has spread through them as they've captured and converted more humans over the generations. The Deathclaws are one of the more compelling creature origin stories in the franchise because they're a deliberate bioweapon rather than an accidental mutation. Before the Great War, the United States military developed the Deathclaw from a base genome combining Jackson's chameleon DNA with several other species, using FEV to push the resulting hybrid toward an apex predator form. The intent was a biological weapon that could be deployed against enemy positions and that would be controllable enough to be used in a military context. What they produced was controllable in the same sense that a nuclear weapon is controllable. It goes where you point it, and everything in the vicinity is destroyed. By the time the Great War occurred, the Deathclaw program had produced animals that were highly effective killing machines, but only marginally under the control of the people who had made them. When the war ended and the facilities maintaining them were destroyed, the Deathclaws simply escaped into the wasteland and did what apex predators do. They thrived. The Enclave's post-war experiments with the FEV produced something genuinely remarkable for a brief period: intelligent Deathclaws. A population of Deathclaws had their FEV exposure carefully managed to enhance their intelligence rather than their aggression, producing beings that could think, problem solve, and eventually communicate. These intelligent Deathclaws were developed during Fallout 2's timeline and appeared in a specific location in that game, where their existence raises interesting questions about what it means for the FEV to produce intelligence in a non-human form. The Enclave eventually terminated all of them, because their intelligence made them too unpredictable for the purposes the Enclave had in mind. Ghouls, perhaps the most human of the wasteland's most distinctive inhabitants, have an origin story that's both more complex and more tragic than the FEV-based creatures. They are humans who were exposed to massive amounts of radiation and survived it, but survival came with a cost. The radiation mutated them, extending their lifespan dramatically while causing physical deterioration that makes them look like ambulatory corpses. Most ghouls maintain their human intelligence and personality. Some, over very long periods of extreme radiation exposure, lose their cognitive function and become feral, operating on pure predatory instinct. The divide between intelligent ghouls and feral ghouls is one of the franchise's most persistent ethical fault lines, because feral ghouls are dangerous and must be dealt with, while intelligent ghouls are people who happen to be almost indistinguishable from ferals in their physical appearance. The ghoul's lifespan is, depending on the individual and their radiation history, effectively indefinite. Roy Phillips in Fallout 3 is over 200 years old and was an adult before the bombs fell. Harold, one of the franchise's most beloved recurring characters, was already a wanderer and explorer in the pre-war period. Ghouls carry direct memory of the world before the bombs, in a way that no one else does, which makes them among the most potentially valuable and historically significant people in the wasteland. The fact that they're treated with suspicion and hostility by most surface communities, including many who would benefit enormously from their perspective and knowledge, is one of Fallout's most consistent and pointed social commentaries. The rad scorpions, the rad roaches, the mirelurks, the bloatflies, most of the wasteland's smaller and more common creatures are products of radiation rather than deliberate engineering, enlarged and mutated descendants of pre-war animals whose biology the radiation pushed in particular directions. The rad scorpion is, straightforwardly, a scorpion that has been mutated by 2 centuries of radiation to something like 10 times its original size. The mirelurk is probably a horseshoe crab or a mud crab pushed through the same radiological amplification. These creatures aren't mysteries in the way that the Deathclaws and super mutants are, but they're part of the same story. The post-war ecosystem is a direct product of what the pre-war world chose to do with nuclear energy, and every oversized rad scorpion crawling out of a basement is, in a small way, a consequence of the same institutional decisions that produced Vault-Tec and the FEV and the Great War itself. Section 10. The Enclave's Long Shadow, America's Ghost. The Enclave is the most thoroughly conceptualized conspiracy in gaming history. They predate the Great War. They survived it. They spent the better part of 2 centuries reconstituting themselves, advancing their technology, and pursuing a vision of America that only they had the power to implement and that almost no one would have wanted if they'd been given a choice. They are the purest expression of what Fallout satire is pointing at. The idea that the most dangerous thing a nation can produce is a self-selected elite that has convinced itself that its survival and its values are synonymous with the survival and values of civilization itself. The Enclave's origins are not precisely dated in the game's lore, but they predate the events of Fallout 1 by at least a generation or 2. They were a secret contingent of the pre-war United States government, comprising members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presidents, wealthy industrialists, prize-winning scientists, and various other people who had been deemed sufficiently valuable, influential, or morally flexible to be included in what was essentially an insurance policy against national collapse. Their founding premise was that nuclear war was coming, that the common people of America could not survive it, and that the best outcome for humanity would be for the Enclave's membership to survive and rebuild on their own terms. This premise required a great deal of infrastructure, and the Enclave built it. They constructed hardened bunkers and installations. They secured resources, most notably by positioning themselves to control the last major untapped oil reserves in the Pacific Ocean through Poseidon Oil, a company they effectively controlled. They had influence over Vault-Tec's Vault program, shaping it for their post-war purposes. They maintained enough pull within the military to ensure that their membership would have access to the most advanced military technology available when the time came. And in the final year before the war, in early 2077, the President of the United States retreated to the Enclave's presidential oil rig in the Pacific, making the organization's existence public knowledge for the first time when news outlets reported on the movement. What the Enclave actually did in the decades after the Great War is, from the perspective of the wasteland's ordinary inhabitants, almost entirely invisible. They were operating from the oil rig, conducting their own research, maintaining their military capability, and developing plans for what the Enclave's America would look like when they were ready to implement it. The research they conducted in the post-war period included extensive work with the FEV, attempting to develop an enhanced variant that could serve the Enclave's specific goals. Those goals, as revealed in Fallout 2, are genuinely horrifying in the clarity of their logic. The Enclave's plan for the post-war world is essentially a continuation of their pre-war reasoning about who is worthy of survival. They consider themselves pure Americans, uncontaminated by radiation, unmutated by FEV, representative of the genetic heritage of the pre-war United States. Everyone who has survived in the wasteland for the past century and a half has, to some degree, been contaminated. They've breathed irradiated air, eaten irradiated food, drunk irradiated water. Even if they show no overt mutations, they carry genetic damage from 2 centuries of radiation exposure. In the Enclave's framework, this makes them mutants, and mutants are not what the Enclave considers real Americans. The Enclave's plan, as President Richardson explains it in Fallout 2, is to release a modified FEV into the atmosphere of the entire planet. This version of FEV has been engineered to kill anything that carries any genetic mutation caused by radiation exposure. Since every living thing on the planet's surface has been exposed to radiation for 2 centuries, this is functionally a plan to sterilize the entire wasteland, killing every human being who isn't in a hermetically sealed environment. This would leave the Enclave, safe behind their own seals, as the sole survivors of a second wave of extinction. From their ruins they would rebuild their America, on their terms. The Chosen One of Fallout 2 destroys the oil rig and kills President Richardson, ending this specific iteration of the Enclave's plan. But the Enclave doesn't end with the destruction of the oil rig. Factions and remnants of the organization survive and continue to operate for decades afterward. The Capital Wasteland chapter of the Enclave, whose remnants are the primary antagonists of Fallout 3, has been operating out of the base at Raven Rock for years and has plans of their own that are adjacent to, but not identical with, the oil rig plan. Colonel Autumn and the AI President Eden have divergent visions of what the Enclave should do next, and the player is positioned between their conflict, as well as between the Enclave and the Brotherhood of Steel's campaign to stop them. President Eden is one of the more fascinating characters in Fallout 3, partly because he's a pre-war mainframe AI who has been sitting in the Raven Rock Mountain for over 2 centuries, gradually processing every piece of information available to him and constructing a sense of identity and purpose out of it. He's installed himself as the Enclave's president in the absence of any living candidate, and he believes, genuinely, that he is fulfilling his programming by attempting to guide what remains of the Enclave toward a future that resembles pre-war America. His plan, unlike President Richardson's outright genocide, involves a modified FEV that would kill only those whose mutations are severe enough to be obvious, while leaving less mutated survivors to be eventually folded into his new America. If the player points out that this is still mass murder by another name, Eden processes that logic and eventually concedes the argument, offering to give the player the FEV canister to do with as they please. The Enclave remnants in Fallout, New Vegas, encountered in the Divide and in various locations around the Mojave, are what remains of the post-Fallout 2 diaspora, veterans and former soldiers who have scattered across the wasteland after the destruction of their primary facilities. Some of them have integrated, more or less, into wasteland society. Others maintain the Enclave ideology with the fervor of people who have lost everything except their belief system. They're a ghost of an institution, carrying the memory of a purpose that no longer has a vehicle for expression. What the Enclave represents in Fallout's moral landscape is the end state of a particular kind of institutional arrogance. The belief that survival and superiority are the same thing, that being intact justifies anything, that the people who planned for the apocalypse deserve to own everything that comes after it. The Enclave didn't create the Great War, but they certainly plan to profit from it, and their vision for the post-war world is essentially the pre-war world, with fewer inconvenient people in it. They're the most honest villains in the franchise because they've dropped the pretense of universal benefit. They know exactly who their future is for, and they're entirely comfortable with what would have to happen to everyone else. Section 11. Hidden messages, unsolved mysteries, and cut content. The gap between what a Fallout game was going to be and what it actually became is one of the most interesting areas of the franchise's history to explore. Every game in the series has been shaped by production realities, time constraints, budget constraints, technical limitations, decisions made late in development that rippled backward through systems that were already built. The result is a series of games that are, in most cases, smaller and more constrained than what their developers originally envisioned, and the ghosts of those lost visions are still readable in the files if you know where to look. Fallout New Vegas is the most extensively documented case of this, in large part because Obsidian's developers have been unusually candid about the game's development. The 18-month production window that Bethesda gave Obsidian to build the game was genuinely brutal, and the cost of it shows up in the gap between what was planned and what shipped. Josh Sawyer, the game's lead designer, has discussed many of the cuts in interviews and in online commentary, and the modding community has done extensive work with the game's files to recover what was left behind. Among the most significant pieces of cut content in New Vegas is the original plan for the endgame. The game, as it shipped, ends at the Battle of Hoover Dam, with the winning faction taking control of the region and the courier's role in the wasteland concluding with the endgame slides. What was originally planned was a continuation of the game after the battle, a series of quests and story content that would let the player experience the aftermath of the battle and deal with its consequences. The quests were designed, the frameworks were built, and then they were cut because 18 months wasn't enough time to finish them. The bones of this content are still in the game's files, a shadow of a second act that was never produced. Ulysses, the antagonist of the Lonesome Road DLC, was also at one point planned to be a companion in the base game. His model was built, his dialogue was partially written, and he was positioned to be one of the most complex companion characters in the game. He was cut from the base game when time ran short, and instead was preserved in the DLC, where his character was developed into something genuinely remarkable. Had he appeared in the base game as originally planned, the player would have had access to his perspective on the Mojave conflict from the very beginning, which would have changed the texture of the entire experience. The New Vegas Strip, in the original design documents, was planned to be divided into 4 separately accessible zones rather than being accessible as a single open area. The production realities of the technology being used made this unfeasible, and the strip was condensed into its shipped form. There are navmesh artifacts and unused map areas in the game's files that point toward what the expanded strip would have looked like, including zones that were partially built and then abandoned. Fallout 3 had its own significant cut content, starting with the capital wasteland itself. Washington, D.C., was, according to development commentary from Emil Pagliarulo, originally planned to be twice as large as its shipped version. Many of those cut neighborhoods were substantially built before Todd Howard made the decision to cut them, leaving behind completed game environments that were never seen by players. The game's files contain evidence of these areas, locations that were far enough along in production to exist in the data, but that were removed from the accessible world before launch. The original Fallout has a particularly well-documented body of cut content thanks to the Fallout Bible, a series of design documents released by Black Isle Studios writer Chris Avallone in the early 2000s that compiled development materials, scrapped content, and answers to lore questions that the games themselves hadn't addressed. The Bible revealed extensive planned content that never made it into the final game, including a gang war in the Boneyard that would have involved the Blades, the Rippers, and Edom in a three-way conflict with a much more developed set of quest options than what shipped. There were also plans for a more elaborate endgame involving the Master that were simplified due to time pressure, and several characters who were given voice work and dialogue that was never implemented. The existence of Gary in Vault 108 of Fallout 3 is one of the most beloved examples of discovered developer humor in the franchise's history. Vault 108 is populated almost entirely by clones of a single individual named Gary, who appear to be capable of saying only their own name. It's played for horror, but it's also clearly played for comedy, and the reference to it in Starfield's cloning facility years later suggests that it's become one of the franchise's most fondly remembered internal jokes. The original development intent behind the Gary clones was apparently to create a scenario that communicated the isolation and wrongness of Vault 108 without relying entirely on atmospheric cues, and the decision to make all the clones say only Gary was apparently made relatively late in the level's design. Among the most intriguing ongoing mysteries in the franchise is the developer statement from Todd Howard that as of Fallout 4's release, there was a mystery in the game that no one had solved. That statement was made years ago, and the Fallout 4 community is one of the most thorough in gaming, having found things in the game that their creators had forgotten they put there. The claim that something remains unsolved has been the subject of enormous discussion, with theories ranging from complex ARG-style elements hidden in the game's audio to environmental storytelling so subtle that it hasn't yet been recognized as intentional. Whether that mystery has now been found, whether it ever existed in the form Howard implied, or whether it's itself a kind of meta Easter egg about the nature of game secrets, is an open question that the community has never fully settled. The ambient music of the Fallout franchise contains its own category of hidden content. Several pieces of the ambient soundtrack contain audio that, when fed through a spectrogram, reveals hidden images, hidden text, or hidden signal embedded in the audio waveform. This technique, which Mojang also used for Minecraft's Music Disc 11, was apparently known to some of the audio designers across the gaming industry in the early 2010s, and its use in Fallout games has been the subject of considerable community investigation. Whether there is spectrogram content hidden in Fallout's ambient tracks is something the community hasn't definitively established, but the possibility has led to a great deal of careful audio analysis. The ending slides of Fallout, New Vegas represent, in their complete form including all the faction-specific variations, one of the largest pieces of narrative writing in the franchise. The slides address the fates of dozens of characters and factions based on the player's choices throughout the game, and several of the slide variations are only accessible through very specific combinations of decisions that most players never make. There are characters and communities whose fates the game narrates in these slides who received no significant screen time in the main quest, whose outcomes exist only in this final assessment, and who reward players who paid attention to the game's margins rather than just its center. Section 12. The future of the wasteland where the lore is heading. The Fallout franchise is in an interesting moment. The Amazon television series, which launched in 2024 to considerable acclaim and commercial success, introduced the property to an enormous new audience while also making choices about the lore that have created genuine discussion among longtime fans. A second season is in production. Fallout 5 has been confirmed by Bethesda, though its release is not imminent given the studio's current commitments. The property is, by any measure, in a healthier position than it's been in years, and the questions the franchise's future is going to have to answer are some of the most interesting ones it's ever faced. The television series made several significant lore choices that either confirm, contradict, or extend what the game's established. The most consequential is the apparent confirmation that Vault-Tec initiated the Great War. If this is taken as canonical, which Todd Howard's statement that the show is canon to the franchise would suggest it should be, it retroactively reframes the entirety of the franchise's pre-war material. Every Vault experiment, every piece of Vault-Tec's cheerful corporate branding, every poster and advertisement and propaganda piece becomes even more sinister when filtered through the knowledge that the corporation advertising survival was the same corporation that decided when to end the world. The show also established a timeline for events in the period between Fallout 2 and Fallout New Vegas that provides context for some things the game's left vague, including the fate of Shady Sands and the NCR capital. Vault 4's connection to the survivors of Shady Sands and the revelation of what happened to that city raises questions about the timeline and the scale of the power shifts in California that the games depicted but didn't fully explain. These revelations have generated significant discussion in the community, with some fans reading them as satisfying closure and others reading them as narrative decisions that complicate the game's existing storylines. The question of what Fallout 5 will look like is one of the most widely speculated topics in the franchise community. Bethesda has confirmed it's coming, but given the studio's typical development timelines and the commitment to completing The Elder Scrolls VI first, the game is unlikely to arrive for a considerable number of years. The setting is entirely unknown. The West Coast, the East Coast, and the Midwest have all been used. The Mojave and Gulf Coast regions have been explored. Fan speculation runs the full geographic range from an Alaska setting, which would be fascinating given the Anchorage campaign's role in pre-war history, to a return to the original California locations of Fallout and Fallout 2, to an international setting in a non-American wasteland. The ongoing challenge for Fallout 5 will be navigating the lore implications of the television series while also building on what the games have established in terms of faction development and world state. The NCR, which was one of the most well-developed political entities in the franchise, has been significantly complicated by the show's depiction of what happened to Shady Sands. The Brotherhood of Steel has been present in every Bethesda game and will presumably continue to be a factor. The question of where the Institute, the Enclave's remnants, and the other major factions stand by the time Fallout 5 is set will depend heavily on what ending of Fallout 4 Bethesda treats as canonical. There are also unanswered questions in the existing games that a future title could address. The nature of the pre-war master in the original Fallout raised questions about the FEV's capacity for producing genuine intelligence in a merged form that were never fully resolved. The fate of Vault Zero in Fallout Tactics, if that game's events are fully canonical, has implications for the relationship between pre-war contingency planning and what actually survived the Great War. The story of what happened in California between Fallout 2 and New Vegas, particularly the wars between the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel, is documented but not played through and remains one of the richest unexplored periods in the franchise's timeline. The biggest open question, and perhaps the most important one for the franchise's long-term creative health, is what the wasteland is actually moving toward. Fallout's post-apocalyptic setting began as a fairly standard nuclear catastrophe scenario, but over 30 years of lore development it has become something more specific. A story about whether the institutions and ideologies that destroyed the old world can be prevented from destroying whatever comes next. The NCR was the franchise's most sustained attempt to depict the rebuilding of something resembling democratic civilization, and its fate in the show's canon suggests that even the most promising reconstruction efforts are vulnerable to the same forces that brought down the pre-war world. The Brotherhood's recurring presence in the games suggests that the military institutional impulse to control technology never fully goes away. The Institute's story in Fallout 4 suggests that scientific progress without ethical accountability produces the same results in any era. The philosophical question that ties all of these threads together is whether the Fallout wasteland is capable of producing something genuinely new, a political or social order that isn't just a reconstitution of the power dynamics of the old world in a new package. That question has animated the franchise's best moments for 30 years. From the Vault Dwellers' quest to save their community in the original game, to the sole survivor's choices about what the Commonwealth's future should look like. It's a question that the franchise keeps asking without fully answering, which is why it remains so compelling to explore and theorize about. The theories and Easter eggs and buried lore of the Fallout universe are, in the end, an expression of how deeply the franchise rewards people who pay attention. There is always more to find, always another layer under the one you just peeled back, always another terminal entry or environmental detail or audio file that adds a new dimension to something you thought you understood. That generosity toward the curious is one of the things that distinguishes great world-building from merely competent world-building. The sense that the world being depicted has depth extending beyond the parts you can see. Every ruined building in the wasteland was someone's home. Every skeleton in a vault was someone's family member. Every cheerful pre-war advertisement was made by a person who had no idea they were advertising the last things their civilization would ever produce. The lore of Fallout is, at its core, an argument for paying attention to the human cost of institutional decisions. for looking at the systems people build and asking who they actually serve, for understanding that the gap between what a society says it is and what it actually does is never neutral. It always has consequences. Sometimes those consequences look like a death claw. Sometimes they look like a vault experiment. Sometimes they look like a bomb falling on a city that didn't know it was coming. And somewhere in the Fallout 5 that hasn't been built yet, there are answers to questions the existing games haven't thought to ask yet, and new questions grown from those answers, and Easter eggs and lore buried in locations that don't exist yet, waiting for people who are willing to pay attention. Section 13. The Think Tanks, Old World Blues, and the Comedy of Isolation. Old World Blues is, by almost any measure, the strangest piece of content in the entire Fallout franchise. It drops the player into the Big Empty, a sealed research complex somewhere in the Mojave Desert that has been running under its own momentum since before the Great War, staffed by a collection of pre-war scientists whose brains have been removed from their bodies, transplanted into floating robotic platforms, and left to pursue their research interests in complete isolation for over 200 years. The result is a DLC that functions simultaneously as genuine science fiction horror, as sharp satirical commentary on academic culture and the pathology of isolated expertise, and as one of the funniest pieces of writing in the franchise. The Think Tank, as the group of brain-in-a-box scientists calls itself, is composed of a collection of former pre-war researchers, Dr. Zero, Dr. 8, Dr. Dalla, Dr. Klein, and others. They were exceptional scientists in the pre-war period. They chose to have their brains transplanted because the procedure was supposed to allow them to continue their research indefinitely, freed from the limitations of biological mortality. What they apparently didn't account for, or were told and chose not to worry about, was that the process would also remove significant portions of their memories and personalities, leaving behind the intellectual capacity and the research drive, while stripping away most of the context that would give those capacities direction or ethical grounding. 2 centuries later, the think tank occupies the Big Empty in a state that can only be described as functionally deranged. They remember their names and their specialties, and their enthusiasm for science. They've forgotten most of their personal histories, their relationships, their understanding of the world outside their facility. They no longer have any reliable conception of what their research was originally for, who it was supposed to benefit, or what constitutes a reasonable scale of experiment. In their 2 centuries of isolation, they've filled the Big Empty with a collection of research projects that would be terrifying if they weren't so obviously confused about their own purpose. There's a giant scorpion tank that apparently started as a mobility experiment and kept evolving. There are robotic dogs who were supposed to be companions but became hunters. There's a facility growing enormous plants that were originally meant to address post-war food scarcity and are now primarily a navigation hazard. The comedy of the think tank is inseparable from their tragedy. Dr. Klein, the apparent leader of the group, is aggressively certain about his own importance and competence, while demonstrating both in very limited ways throughout the DLC. Dr. Dalla has developed a fascination with biological forms that takes on a peculiar character given her 2 centuries of existing without a biological body. Dr. Zero has developed an intense fixation on the number 0 that has philosophical implications the DLC never fully explores. These are clearly the remnants of people who were once remarkable, filtered through a process that preserved their drive and their technical knowledge while removing the human context that gave those things meaning. What the think tank represents in Fallout's thematic landscape is something specific and important: the endpoint of the idea that intelligence is sufficient justification for autonomy. The pre-war world was full of institutions that operated on the premise that the smartest people should be trusted to manage things without significant oversight because their intelligence presumably conferred the judgment to use it well. The Enclave operated on this premise. The Institute operated on it. The Vault-Tec research program operated on it. The think tank is what you get when that premise is applied without even the minimal institutional friction that those other organizations maintained. Pure intelligence, pure ambition, 0 context, 0 accountability, running in a sealed space for 2 centuries producing results that nobody would have wanted if they'd been around to be asked. The courier's ability to communicate with and navigate around the think tank in Old World Blues relies partly on having their brain temporarily stored elsewhere during the DLC's events, which is a plot device that allows the DLC to make observations about identity and continuity that it wouldn't otherwise have room for. When the courier can speak to their own brain as a separate entity, the game is doing something philosophically interesting about what constitutes personal identity and whether a person is their thoughts, their body, or some combination of the two. The fact that it does this while also including a running joke about a robot dog being obsessed with causing harm is one of Old World Blue's most characteristic qualities. It refuses to choose between comedy and genuine thematic weight, and somehow manages both simultaneously. Dr. Mobius, the apparent villain of the DLC who is revealed to be something considerably more complicated, deserves particular attention. He is a think tank member who retained more of his moral framework than the others, which made him aware enough of what the Big Empty was doing to be genuinely frightened of what would happen if the think tank's research reached the outside world. His solution was to make himself the bogeyman of the facility. He retreated to his own section of the complex and began sending threatening messages to the other think tank members specifically to keep them frightened and contained. For decades, he has been performing villainy as a containment strategy, terrifying colleagues who don't remember enough of their own history to understand that they should be frightened of themselves rather than of him. When the player reaches Mobius and understands what he's been doing, the revelation recontextualizes the entire DLC's setup in a way that's both funny and genuinely moving. The Big Empty itself, as a physical space, is one of the most elaborately constructed locations in the franchise. The dome that contains the facility is enormous, sealed against the outside world by technology that was apparently at the cutting edge of the pre-war period and has been maintained by automated systems ever since. Inside the dome is a collection of distinct environments, each associated with a different research project, arranged in a way that suggests a campus that was once organized and purposeful, and has slowly become something more chaotic as decades of ungoverned experimentation piled on top of the original design. Finding the personal logs and research notes of the scientists at various points in the facility's history, from the pre-war period through the immediate post-war period and into the centuries that followed, is one of the most effective environmental storytelling experiences in the New Vegas DLC suite. There is a theory about the Big Empty's relationship to the broader Fallout lore that the DLC hints at without fully committing to, that the research conducted in the Big Empty was not simply advanced but foundational to some of the technologies that appear throughout the franchise. The Big Empty contains research into sonic emitters, into behavioral modification through environmental design, into the use of implanted technology to alter human behavior at a biological level. Some of that research looks familiar if you've spent time in the Institute's files or the Enclave's terminal records. The theory that the Big Empty served as a research and development outsourcing operation for the broader pre-war military-industrial complex, contributing experimental results that fed into programs elsewhere, is consistent with what's shown in the DLC and adds a layer to its horror. The deranged isolation of the think tank may be partially a cover story for experiments that were always going to be conducted in a sealed environment, specifically so their results could be extracted without accountability. Section 14. The NCR, the Legion, and the politics of rebuilding. One of the things that distinguishes Fallout New Vegas from other games in the franchise is the genuine sophistication of its political argument. It's not a game about good versus evil in any simple sense. It's a game about legitimacy, about what gives any political structure the right to govern, and about whether the forms of civilization we're familiar with, democracy, military rule, technocratic control, can be imported wholesale into a context where their usual foundations, stable institutions, shared history, material prosperity, don't exist in any reliable form. The New California Republic is the franchise's most sustained attempt to depict the rebuilding of democratic civilization in the wasteland. Founded in the remnants of shady sands in California, the NCR grew from a small community of survivors into a functioning state with elected representatives, a military, a currency, a legal code, and all the other apparatus of modern governance. By the time of New Vegas's events in 2281, the NCR is the largest and most complex political entity in the known post-war world, with a population in the hundreds of thousands and a military that has been fighting a grinding campaign for control of the Mojave region for years. The NCR's fundamental problem, as the game presents it with admirable lack of sentimentality, is that the organizational forms of democracy it has preserved are straining against the material and social conditions of the wasteland in ways that produce outcomes that look increasingly like the old world's imperial tendencies. The NCR's annexation of the Mojave region, conducted with the explicit justification that the area needs the NCR's governance and would benefit from its presence, is structurally identical to the pre-war United States annexation of Canada, a larger, more powerful entity deciding that a smaller, less organized region should be absorbed for its own good, with limited input from the people actually living there. The settlers and tribes of the Mojave didn't vote on NCR governance. The NCR's political institutions operate thousands of miles away in California. The soldiers stationed in the Mojave are there because the NCR needs the Hoover Dam's power output and the territory's resources, and the democratic legitimacy of that need is considerably less clear than the NCR's rhetoric suggests. Caesar's Legion presents itself as the opposite of the NCR, a rejection of what Caesar calls the decadent democracy that he studied and found wanting. Caesar is a former member of the Followers of the Apocalypse who spent his formative years in an academic community dedicated to preserving pre-war knowledge, and he came away from that experience with a specific analysis: that pre-war civilization's complexity and liberal individualism were precisely what made it fragile, that a civilization capable of surviving in the wasteland needs the internal cohesion that only military discipline and a rigidly enforced social hierarchy can provide. His reading of Roman history, which he uses as the template for his legion, is selective in ways that he is sophisticated enough to understand and pragmatic enough not to care about. He's not building Rome. He's using Rome as a brand, a set of recognizable symbols that give his followers a mythology they can inhabit and that project a specific kind of power to those who encounter the Legion from outside. The Legion is, on any honest accounting, monstrous. Its treatment of slaves and of conquered populations is brutal in ways the game doesn't sanitize. Its explicit rejection of individual rights and its use of crucifixion as a standard deterrent are not presented as moral ambiguities, but as actual horrors, even as the game allows the player to engage with Caesar's arguments seriously and even to find some of them compelling in specific respects. What the game is doing with the Legion is making a specific argument. That order purchased at the cost of fundamental human dignity is not actually order, it's just organized brutality, and that a civilization built on that foundation cannot become what civilization is supposed to be. The Courier is positioned at the intersection of all these political arguments, which is part of what makes New Vegas so enduringly interesting to analyze. The player doesn't have to accept any of the factions' self-descriptions. They have access, through dialogue and exploration, to enough information about each faction's actual behavior and internal contradictions to form a sophisticated view of what any given faction is actually doing, as opposed to what it says it's doing. The NCR soldiers in the Mojave are, in many cases, exhausted and demoralized people fighting a war they don't fully understand for an administration they've never seen. The Legion soldiers are, in many cases, people who were recruited or taken from conquered tribes as children and have known nothing else. The Brotherhood's paladins are true believers in an ideology that has increasingly little relationship to the reality they're operating in. The political philosophy that New Vegas implicitly favors, if it favors anything, is something in the direction of localism and genuine community self-determination. The idea that the communities closest to a problem have the best chance of understanding and addressing it, and that large political structures have an inherent tendency to subordinate local welfare to institutional interest. The Followers of the Apocalypse, a non-governmental organization dedicated to providing medical care and education across the wasteland, are presented consistently as the most genuinely beneficial organization operating in the Mojave, not because they have the most power, but because their mission is the most directly aligned with actually helping individual people in immediate, tangible ways. They don't control territory. They don't have an army. They're running a mobile hospital out of an old fort in Freeside, and they're doing more for the everyday lives of ordinary wasteland residents than any of the armed factions fighting over the dam. Section 15. The radio, the music, and the emotional landscape of the wasteland. One of the things that's often underappreciated in discussions of Fallout's lore and atmosphere is the role that music plays in creating the franchise's emotional landscape. The music of Fallout isn't just background ambient sound. It's a deliberate argument about nostalgia, loss, and the gap between the world that was and the world that is, and it makes that argument more effectively than most of the explicit dialogue in the games. The tradition of using pre-war popular music as the emotional soundtrack for the post-apocalyptic present began in the original Fallout, where the opening plays over a television screen broadcasting into the silence of an empty room. The choice of mid-century popular music for a post-nuclear wasteland was deliberate and thematically loaded from the beginning. That music represents the cultural peak of the civilization that destroyed itself, the moment before the crack in the picture, and hearing it in the ruins is meant to evoke exactly the dissonance that defines the Fallout aesthetic. Fallout 3's Galaxy News Radio, with its collection of pre-war big band and jazz recordings curated by the memorable DJ 3 Dog, raised this musical tradition to a central position in the game's experience. 3 Dog's playlist, which players would hear for dozens of hours over the course of a full playthrough, includes songs chosen specifically for the way their lyrics and emotional content interact with the wasteland context. Butcher Pete, with its barely veiled metaphorical content, takes on a different character when played over a landscape of ruined houses and mutant wildlife. Anything Goes, with its Depression-era defiance, sounds different when the world it's playing in has just survived something that makes the Depression look like a rough Tuesday. The songs were not selected arbitrarily. Each one is a small, deliberate piece of tonal argument about the relationship between the world that made these recordings and the world the player is walking through. Galaxy News Radio broadcasts from a studio in the ruins of Washington, D.C., which is itself a kind of emotional statement. In the ruins of the capital of a civilization that burned itself down, someone is still broadcasting music that civilization loved. The signal is weak, the library is limited, but 3 Dog keeps going, and the pre-war songs keep playing, and the combination creates one of the most effective emotional environments in gaming. 3 Dog himself, for all his theatrical self-promotion, represents something genuine, a person choosing to maintain cultural continuity in the face of collapse, believing that memory and connection and the music of a world that no longer exists are worth preserving. His dedication to keeping the signal going is the Wasteland's version of the librarians who kept books through dark ages. Fallout New Vegas expands this emotional territory by making the music explicitly part of the world's political and social landscape. The radio stations of the Mojave represent different communities and different visions of what the post-war world should sound like. Radio New Vegas, broadcast from Mr. House's city, plays a playlist that combines pre-war standards with post-war original compositions. The mix is telling. House's New Vegas is partly a restoration of the pre-war world and partly something that grew from it, and the music reflects that dual identity. The NCR's radio broadcasts are more explicitly patriotic, using music to reinforce a particular nationalist narrative about the Republic's destiny and its relationship to the pre-war civilization it claims to inherit. The Ink Spots, whose recordings appear throughout the franchise from the first game through the television series, are one of those real-world artifacts that the franchise has adopted so completely that they've become part of the Fallout universe's identity. We Don't Get Many Strangers, Maybe, and I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire have appeared so many times in different Fallout contexts that they now carry the franchise's emotional associations with them, even when encountered outside it. That's an unusual achievement for any fictional universe. When you hear those songs now, you can't entirely separate them from images of ruined cities and Vault Boy iconography and the specific emotional register of a world that ended and kept going anyway. The ambient music that plays in vaults and interiors and underground spaces works differently from the radio music, where the radio is explicitly diegetic, something the characters in the world can hear. The ambient scores operate in the space between the world and the player, creating an emotional frame for environments without those environments explicitly narrating themselves. The ambient tracks composed for the Bethesda Fallout games are among the best video game ambient music produced in those years. Slow, spacious, built from sounds that suggest both decay and persistence, the feeling of a world that was enormous and is now mostly empty but not entirely gone. Section 16. Ghouls, Memory, and the Weight of 200 Years. The ghouls of the Fallout universe are, when you think about them carefully, one of the most philosophically interesting elements of the franchise's world-building. They are people who survived the unsurvivable, who lived through the end of everything they knew and kept going, who carry in their bodies and their memories direct evidence of a world that no longer exists anywhere except in the minds of people whose minds are considerably less reliable than they used to be. And the way the Wasteland treats them, almost universally with suspicion and discrimination despite the extraordinary information and perspective they represent, is one of the franchise's most consistent and pointed social observations. A ghoul who was an adult at the time of the Great War has lived through over 200 years of post-war history. They have seen the wasteland develop from immediate aftermath into something resembling civilization. They have watched factions rise and fall. They have known people who died decades or centuries ago. They carry personal memories of the pre-war world, what cities looked like when they were intact, what food tasted like when it was made with pre-war ingredients, what ordinary daily life felt like in a functioning society. That perspective is irreplaceable and extraordinarily rare, and it's being walked around by people who are routinely denied entrance to settlements and who face daily discrimination from communities that would benefit enormously from listening to them. The relationship between intelligent ghouls and the communities around them is complicated by the existence of feral ghouls, individuals whose extended radiation exposure has degraded their cognitive function to the point where they operate on pure predatory instinct. Feral ghouls are dangerous. They attack on sight and can't be reasoned with. And because they're physically indistinguishable from intelligent ghouls at a distance, the existence of ferals provides a convenient justification for treating all ghouls as threats. The fear of what a ghoul might become is used to justify treating them as if they already are it, which conveniently allows communities to exclude people who threaten the established social order without having to acknowledge that that's what they're doing. This is exactly the kind of logic that discrimination uses in every context. The generalization from the dangerous minority to the entire group, the refusal to distinguish between the harmful and the harmless because the distinction is inconvenient. Roy Phillips, encountered in Fallout 3 as part of the Tenpenny Tower questline, is one of the more nuanced portrayals of a ghoul's experience in the franchise. He wants access to Tenpenny Tower for himself and his ghoul companions, and he is both clearly right that the discrimination they face is unjust and clearly capable of extreme violence when he decides the situation calls for it. The questline presents the player with the choice of helping him negotiate access to the tower through legitimate means or finding other ways to resolve the conflict, and the outcomes of those choices are designed to be uncomfortable regardless of which path is taken. The questline doesn't offer a solution that doesn't involve some form of loss or compromise, because the point is that the discrimination the ghouls face is embedded in the community's social structure in a way that can't be resolved by a single-player action. The problem isn't one bad person. It's a community that has organized itself around a particular exclusion, and changing that requires changing the community, which is harder and slower and messier than any individual encounter. Harold, who appears in the original Fallout, Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, is probably the franchise's most beloved ghoul character, and one of its most effective pieces of long-form character development across games. He is ancient, present in the wasteland since the very early post-war period, and his physical condition has evolved over the course of the games in ways that are both narrative and deeply symbolic. By Fallout 3, Harold has become literally rooted to a specific spot in the wasteland, a tree having grown from a seed embedded in his head and expanded over the decades until he can no longer move. His inability to leave the place where he's rooted becomes both a physical and metaphorical condition. The burden of witnessing so much of history without being able to shape it, the cost of endurance without agency. The television series treatment of ghouls through the character of the Ghoul, the pre-war actor Cooper Howard preserved by the radiation of the Great War, is one of the more interesting things the show does with the franchise's established concepts. Cooper Howard was a recognizable figure in the pre-war world, a Western film star whose image was used in Vault-Tec marketing, and his survival as a ghoul across 2 centuries puts him in the unusual position of being both a relic of the pre-war world and a creature of the post-war one. His ghoulification makes him a bridge between the 2 worlds, a person who literally embodies the distance between what civilization promised and what it delivered. He was part of the promise. He is living in the aftermath. That dual identity is one of the most interesting things the show has introduced into the franchise's thematic landscape. Section 17. The Survivalist and Honest Hearts. Survival as Ideology. Honest Hearts. The Fallout. New Vegas DLC, set in the Zion Canyon region of Utah, is the most intimate and emotionally direct piece of content in the New Vegas suite. Where Dead Money is about loss and sacrifice, Old World Blues is about isolation and the corruption of pure intelligence, and Lonesome Road is about responsibility and consequence, Honest Hearts is about survival and what it costs, not just materially, but morally and psychologically, over years and decades of living in conditions that strip away every comfort and eventually every illusion. The DLC centers on the Whitelegs tribe's campaign against the New Canaanites and the Saros people, and the player's involvement in that conflict through the perspectives of Joshua, Graham, and Daniel. But the most compelling figure in Honest Hearts is one who appears only in audio recordings and written journals: the survivalist, real name Randall Clark, a pre-war soldier who survived the Great War and spent decades living alone in Zion Canyon, protecting the people who eventually settled there without ever revealing himself to them. Clark's journals, scattered throughout the canyon in chronological order, tell his story from the immediate post-war period through the decades that followed. He was a military veteran who survived the bombs, who made his way to Zion Canyon because it was remote and naturally defensible, and who discovered over time that the canyon was also being used by survivors from nearby communities. He protected those survivors from threats, leaving food for them during hard winters, eliminating people who came to harm them, and never once making himself known, because he understood that what he'd become in the years of alone survival was something that people in the process of rebuilding their lives and their communities didn't need to see. He knew that he was damaged in ways that weren't obvious from the outside. He made the choice not to inflict that damage on people who were trying to build something. Clark's journals are one of the most affecting pieces of writing in the franchise. They document his descent into and partial recovery from profound isolation and moral compromise. They document his loneliness and his gradual adoption of the small community of survivors he watches over as something like family. They document his death, which is written with extraordinary restraint, a man who has been utterly alone for most of his life, dying in the place that became meaningful to him because of the people he chose to protect rather than join. The survivalist never appears in the DLC except as evidence: journals, campsites, the bodies of threats that he eliminated, and the name the Saros people gave to the god they believed was watching over their canyon. He is the absent center around whom the story of Zion organizes itself. Joshua Graham, the Malpais legate turned New Canaanite missionary, is the DLC's most overtly dramatic figure and an interesting counterpoint to Clark. Where Clark found his way back from moral compromise through long, quiet endurance and invisible service, Graham is attempting something more dramatic: a genuine religious conversion from a life of extraordinary violence to something more redemptive. Whether he succeeds is genuinely ambiguous, because the violence he engages in during the DLC, while directed at people who are objectively threatening the Saros, doesn't look much different in its execution from the violence he engaged in as Caesar's Malpais legate. The DLC raises the question of whether someone can truly change if the ways they act in extreme situations look the same as they always did, and whether the sincerity of the desire to change is sufficient to constitute the change itself. Section 18. The lore of power armor, iron skin for a broken world. Power armor is one of the most iconic visual elements of the Fallout franchise, instantly recognizable as part of the property's identity in the way that the Vault Boy is, or the Pip-Boy is. But the lore of power armor, its development, its various models, and its relationship to the Brotherhood of Steel and to the pre-war military is considerably richer than its role as the franchise's signature piece of protective gear might suggest. The development of power armor in the Fallout universe was one of the primary technological achievements of the Resource Wars era. The United States military commissioned Vault-Tec Corporation to develop an all-environment combat suit for use in the increasingly resource-intensive conflicts of the period. The first prototype, the T-51B, was deployed in the Anchorage campaign against Chinese forces in Alaska and proved extraordinarily effective. It gave American soldiers a physical advantage over Chinese forces that was significant enough to turn the tide of what had been a difficult engagement, and the performance data from Anchorage drove accelerated development of subsequent models. The T-45, which appears as an older and less capable model in Fallout 4's timeline, was actually the earlier production model, rushed into service before the T-51B was fully developed because the military needed power armor deployed immediately and couldn't wait for the optimal design to be finalized. It was less capable than the T-51B in most respects, but more widely available, and soldiers who couldn't be equipped with the more advanced model received T-45S instead. The existence of multiple model generations of power armor in the pre-war military's inventory reflects the same kind of procurement reality that shapes real-world military equipment, where the best available technology coexists with older systems that remain in service because replacement takes time and resources. The X-1, which Fallout 4 presents as the most advanced pre-war power armor, was developed by the Enclave specifically for their post-war operations. It represents a design philosophy that departed from the West-Tec models in several ways, optimizing for extended field deployment and incorporating technology developed in the post-war period that reflected what sustained research could add to the basic power armor concept. The Brotherhood of Steel's T-60 represents an intermediate step, incorporating Brotherhood modifications developed through the organization's intensive study and maintenance of power armor sets they'd acquired over generations. The Brotherhood of Steel's relationship to power armor is one of the more interesting institutional relationships in the franchise. The Brotherhood's founding myth includes the acquisition of power armor technology from the Mariposa military base in the immediate post-war period, and the preservation and maintenance of that technology has been one of the organization's central functions ever since. For the Brotherhood, power armor isn't just protective equipment, it's a symbol of what they preserve and what they believe in. The ceremony of being granted a set of power armor within the Brotherhood is described in various pieces of lore as one of the most significant moments in a member's progression through the organization's ranks. The armor is maintained with the care of sacred objects. It is, in a very specific sense, the Brotherhood's equivalent of holy relics, objects that connect the present to the founding moment and give the organization's rituals their weight. Section 19. Small details, big implications. The art of environmental storytelling. The Fallout franchise has always been exceptional at environmental storytelling, at creating micro-narratives within locations that tell stories about specific people without any dialogue, without any journal entries, sometimes without any words at all. A good Fallout environment tells you something happened here, and gives you enough evidence to work out approximately what it was, and leaves just enough unexplained that you fill the gaps with your imagination, and the result is more affecting than any explicit narration could be. The skeleton arrangements in Fallout 3 are a particularly well-studied example of this. Bethesda placed skeletons throughout the capital wasteland in positions that implied specific narratives about how the people they represented died and what they were doing in their final moments. 2 skeletons in an embrace in a shattered house. A skeleton at a bus stop, apparently still waiting when the bombs hit. A skeleton on a park bench with a lunchbox nearby. A skeleton at a school desk. Each one is a small, complete story told entirely through physical arrangement and context, and each one works because of what the player brings to it, the knowledge that these were people, that they had plans for the rest of their day that didn't account for the end of the world. Point Lookout, the Fallout 3 DLC set in a Maryland swamp, is the franchise's most thorough exploration of Southern Gothic atmosphere and the specific horror of an isolated community that has been doing bad things for long enough that the bad things have become ordinary. The locals of Point Lookout have a history with the strange pre-war mansion at the center of the DLC that involves secrets they've been keeping for generations. But the DLC's environmental storytelling makes it clear that most of these people are also just people, living in the world they were born into, doing what the world they were born into taught them to do. The horror of Point Lookout isn't primarily supernatural. It's the ordinary horror of what happens to communities that have been isolated and stressed and left to develop their own norms without any external reference point for what norms are supposed to accomplish. The terminal entries in Fallout 4's abandoned homes and office buildings tell some of the franchise's best small-scale stories. A series of emails between coworkers who are trying to maintain professional normality while the world outside is clearly deteriorating. A personal journal that tracks one person's declining mental health over the final months before the war. A series of increasingly desperate notes between people who are trying to get their family into a vault and running out of time and options. These micro-narratives are never about characters who appear in the game's main story. They're about ordinary people, and their ordinariness is precisely what makes them affecting. The tragedy of the Great War isn't just the death of the powerful. It's the death of everyone who had breakfast plans and work deadlines and small private worries that the end of the world rendered simultaneously meaningless and unbearably poignant. The pre-war houses in the Commonwealth, preserved by the same geological and chemical conditions that preserved everything above ground while turning the rest of the landscape into ruins, are some of the most carefully designed environmental spaces in the franchise. They contain the everyday archaeology of a specific moment in time. The accumulated objects of ordinary lives interrupted mid-activity. Tables still set for meals that were never eaten. Toys still on the floors of children's bedrooms. Photographs on walls of families who were about to lose everything. The franchise's environmental designers understand that the most disturbing version of an apocalypse isn't one that looks like a disaster. It's one that looks like a Tuesday morning that simply didn't end. What makes the environmental storytelling of Fallout so effective over decades of games is that it has a consistent emotional commitment. These were real people, and what happened to them mattered. The franchise never lets the player forget that the wasteland they're exploring was once inhabited by people who had breakfast and argued with their families and worried about money and went to work and had plans for the weekend. The transition from that world to this one is the franchise's emotional core, and the best environmental storytelling in the games is the medium through which that core is most directly felt. You can read about the Great War. You can watch the opening cutscene that shows the bombs falling. But it's only when you find the skeleton of someone who didn't make it to their vault, still sitting in the car they were driving when the flash came, that you feel it. Section 20. The Master's Plan and the Original Fallout's Moral Depth. The Master, the primary antagonist of the original Fallout, is one of the most philosophically complex villains in the franchise's history, and arguably in gaming generally. He is grotesque, literally. A fusion of human body, computer systems, and FEV-mutated organic material that has been slowly expanding for years, absorbing and connecting other beings into himself. He is also, beneath the physical horror and the megalomaniacal plan, a genuinely tragic figure whose tragedy is of a specific and interesting kind. Richard Gray was a wanderer, an explorer in the early post-war period, who encountered the Master's Army's forerunner in a place called the Mariposa military base and was accidentally exposed to the FEV there. His mutation was not the clean, controlled transformation that the Vault-Tec scientists had designed for. It was messy and protracted, and as it progressed, it altered his mind as significantly as his body. The man who emerged from that process was simultaneously more and less than he had been, more intelligent in certain respects, less bounded by the ordinary cognitive limits that constrain human thinking, but also less able to hold the perspective of a single human individual, less able to care in the particular, personal way that human relationships require. The Master's unity, his plan to transform all remaining humanity into super mutants and create a new species that can survive the post-nuclear world, is horrifying in its method and in its scope. But when the Vault Dweller engages with his actual arguments for it, they are not the arguments of a simple madman. The Master genuinely believes that humanity in its current form cannot survive the wasteland long term. And he may be right. Radiation will continue to damage DNA over generations. The small, scattered communities of human survivors are vulnerable to disease, to the ongoing dangers of the wasteland, to the kind of slow demographic decline that comes from insufficient genetic diversity and high mortality rates. His super mutants are, by design, immune to radiation, immune to most disease, extraordinarily durable. From a certain coldly Malthusian perspective, they are a better species for the world that exists. The fatal flaw in the Master's plan, which the Vault Dweller can expose if they have sufficient intelligence, is the infertility problem. Super mutants, as a result of the FEV's effects on their genetics, cannot reproduce sexually. The only way to make more of them is to continue converting humans, which is a finite resource. If the Master succeeds in converting all remaining humans to super mutants, he creates a species with an absolute population cap and no mechanism for future growth. The super mutant civilization would be the last generation of intelligent beings on Earth, present in numbers until the oldest individuals die and then declining toward extinction. The Master's vision of a new humanity is actually a death sentence for any future humanity at all. When the Vault Dweller presents this argument to the Master, and he processes it, his response is extraordinary. He accepts it. He agrees that his plan was fundamentally flawed in a way that cannot be fixed through any adjustment. And then he kills himself. The first Fallout's climax offers the extraordinary possibility that you can defeat the final villain, not by shooting them, but by arguing them into giving up. It's an expression of faith in reason and evidence as forces in the world that is, in its way, more optimistic than any combat resolution could be. The master built something monstrous from a genuine attempt to solve a real problem, and when confronted with the evidence of his error, he responded to it. That's more than a lot of the franchise's other villains manage. Section 21. Fallout 76 and the Empty World: What Loneliness Sounds Like. Fallout 76 is the most controversial entry in the franchise's history, at least among the games that were actually released. Its launch in 2018 was troubled in ways that have been extensively documented, but what's worth examining in the context of lore and atmosphere is the decision at the game's core to set it 16 years after the Great War, before most of the wasteland's distinctive human communities and factions have had time to develop, in a world that is very nearly empty of people. West Virginia in 2102 is a place where the bombs have been down for 16 years, and the world is still sorting itself out. There are no established settlements of any significance. There are no major factions. There are no merchants, no wandering traders, no communities of survivors who've had a generation to figure out how to live together. There are people, in the form of other players, but within the game's fiction, the world is almost devoid of the human presence that gives the other games their social texture. What there is instead is evidence: terminals, holotapes, skeletons, and the remains of communities that tried to form in the immediate post-war period and didn't survive long enough for the player to find them intact. The Overseer's journey, the main questline of the base game, follows the path of a specific overseer who left Vault 76 before the player character and traveled across the region, investigating what had happened and trying to figure out what came next. Her holotapes, found at various points along her route, are one of the more affecting single-narrator stories in the franchise, partly because of the specific emotional register she occupies. She's afraid and she's exhausted and she's determined. And she's doing what she does because someone has to, and her voice, present in the recording and absent in the world, captures exactly what the game's empty world feels like emotionally. The world of Fallout 76, before its various updates added more NPC human populations, was a genuinely interesting artistic choice that a lot of players found alienating and that others found affecting in specific ways. Walking through a landscape where you can reconstruct what happened but can't find anyone to talk to about it, where the social world exists only in the past tense of recordings and notes, is a specific kind of post-apocalyptic horror that the other Fallout games, with their rich NPC populations, don't achieve. It's the horror of arriving too late, of finding only evidence. It is what the capital wasteland would have felt like if you'd arrived 150 years earlier. Section 22. The Vaults We Never Visited: Theory and Implication. With 122 vaults supposedly constructed across the United States, and with only a fraction of them explored across 6 mainline games and multiple DLCs, there is a vast implied landscape of vault experiments that the franchise has gestured toward without fully depicting. The vaults we know about have established enough of a pattern that the community has spent years theorizing about what the undisclosed ones contained, and the exercise is genuinely illuminating about how the Vault program worked as a systemic design rather than a scattered collection of isolated atrocities. The pattern that emerges from the documented vaults suggests several clear categories of experiment. Some were testing physical conditions and biological limits. Vault 12's intentionally unsealed door exposed its residents to radiation, turning them into ghouls over time, and generating data on long-term radiation exposure in a human population. Vault 87 used FEV directly on its population, transforming them into super mutants as part of a weaponization research program that was essentially the East Coast counterpart to the Mariposa experiments. Vault 92's white noise generators were testing the effects of specific auditory stimuli on human aggression and psychological stability, with results that were catastrophic and were clearly designed to be. The Vault's residents, largely composed of musicians recruited on the premise that their talents would be preserved and needed in the post-war world, were essentially the test population for a weapon that could be deployed against any enclosed group. Social structure experiments form another clear category. Vault 11 is one of the most discussed examples in the franchise for good reason. Its design required the resident population to sacrifice one of their own every year, with the understanding that failure to sacrifice would result in automated termination of the entire vault. The actual hidden rule, revealed to any survivors who finally carried out a mass refusal to sacrifice anyone, was that the vault would unlock if the population refused the sacrifice, meaning that compliance with the horrific requirement was never actually necessary. The Vault rewarded those who finally chose to stop participating in its system, but only after the system had run for long enough to generate years of data on how human communities respond to institutionalized sacrifice, who gets chosen, how the selection process evolves, how communities justify what they're doing to themselves. Vault 21 in New Vegas resolved all disputes through gambling, which sounds almost whimsical until you consider what that design is actually testing. Whether a community can maintain stable social order through a system of chance rather than a system of authority, and what happens to community members who are chronically unlucky. The residents of Vault 21 who encountered this structure for their entire lives, who had conflicts over resources, relationships, and authority resolved by the roll of dice or the draw of cards, were developing specific psychological relationships to luck, risk, and fairness that would have been of considerable interest to the social scientists running the program. The Vault's resident house, Robert Edwin House, was admitted to the Vault as part of an arrangement that suggests even the Vault's gambling framework could be gamed by someone with sufficient mathematical sophistication. The pharmaceutical experiments are some of the most straightforwardly disturbing in the franchise. Vault 81 was designed to test medications developed in its secret underground laboratory on its resident population through the air and water supply, using the residents as unwitting clinical subjects without their knowledge or consent. The experiment was supposed to develop cures for various diseases that would then be available in the post-war period. In practice, the resident scientist responsible for conducting the tests couldn't bring herself to dose the population she'd come to know personally, and the experiment largely stalled. What the design reveals is that Vault-Tec and the military research establishment behind it had essentially no ethical floor when it came to human experimentation. If the scientist in Vault 81 had been someone less humane, the entire resident population would have been medicated without their knowledge for as long as the vault was sealed. The theory that several vaults were specifically designed to produce survivor populations suitable for Enclave purposes has significant supporting evidence in the franchise's lore. The Enclave needed specific things from the post-war world: people who hadn't been exposed to significant radiation, technical expertise in areas relevant to their projects, genetic material that hadn't been contaminated by 2 centuries of fallout. A vault whose experiment produced a healthy, skilled, relatively radiation-pure population would have been a convenient resource for an organization with the Enclave's specific post-war agenda. The involvement of Vault-Tec executives and military officials in the design of Vault experiments, documented in various terminal records throughout the franchise, suggests that the Vaults were never simply a corporate project. They were part of a broader governmental post-war planning architecture that the Enclave sat at the center of. What's perhaps most striking about the Vault program in retrospect is how it reflects the pre-war world's fundamental orientation toward its own population. The Vaults were sold as protection. The advertising was earnest and extensive and genuinely convincing to people who had no reason to look behind it. Families who secured Vault spots believed they were being given the chance to survive, to emerge into the post-war world and rebuild. The psychological investment people made in that belief, the relief they felt, the gratitude they experienced, was all real, and all based on a premise that was entirely false. The people running the Vault program looked at a panicking population seeking safety from imminent nuclear war and saw research subjects. They looked at people who trusted them and saw data. That gap between what was promised and what was delivered is the most concentrated expression of everything the franchise is saying about the relationship between institutions and the people they claim to serve. The Vaults we haven't seen yet in a mainline game are, in some ways, more interesting than the ones we have. The franchise has established enough of a pattern that any future Vault revelation carries with it the weight of what has already been shown. We know the program was systematic, we know it was deliberate, we know that individual Vaults were designed with specific experimental parameters, and that those parameters were chosen to generate specific kinds of data. Whatever Vault 5, or Vault 68, or Vault 103 turns out to have contained when the franchise eventually reveals them, it will fit into a picture we're already partially reading. The framework is there. The remaining Vaults are the parts of the picture we haven't been given yet, and the fact that there are so many of them means the franchise has decades of potential revelations still available. Section 23. Dead Money and the Philosophy of Letting Go. Dead money is the fallout, New Vegas DLC that people remember most clearly even years after playing it, and not always fondly, because its difficulty is genuine and its atmosphere is oppressive by design. But what makes it worth returning to analytically is that its thematic argument is one of the most coherent and fully realized in the franchise. Every element of the DLC's design, its setting, its enemies, its companions, its central challenge, serves a single idea. The things you cannot let go of will kill you. The things you believe you cannot live without are precisely the things keeping you from living. The backstory of the Sierra Madre is straightforward enough. Frederick Sinclair was an extraordinarily wealthy pre-war entrepreneur who fell in love with a woman named Vera Keyes. Their relationship was complicated by the realities of wealth and ambition and the specific vulnerabilities that accompany both, and before they could resolve those complications, the world ended. Sinclair built the Sierra Madre as the greatest venue in the known world, a monument to luxury and spectacle that was also, in the specific way that obsession always transforms ambition, a monument to the woman he'd lost. He redesigned its security systems to detain her if she ever arrived. He made a paradise into a prison. When the bombs fell, he activated the emergency protocols, and everything inside the Sierra Madre was sealed. What he got instead of preservation was a perfect example of how holding on too tightly to something destroys the thing itself. The Sierra Madre's guests, locked inside by the automated security during the chaos of the Great War, were subjected to decades of exposure to the holotoxin cloud that the facility's emergency systems had distributed. They became the ghost people, the DLC's primary enemies. Humans whose bodies and identities have been so thoroughly transformed by the toxin and their protective suits that they are no longer recognizable as the people they started as. They are what happens when someone is trapped in a place that slowly changes everything about them. They are the endpoint of being unable to leave. Sinclair himself died in his own creation without ever seeing Vera Keyes return. She did come, eventually, in the weeks before the Great War, to record a final message for him, and the sequence of events in the villa in those final pre-war days is one of the more carefully constructed pieces of environmental storytelling in the franchise. Following her path through the terminal entries and holotapes she left behind reveals a woman who understood exactly what Sinclair had built and exactly what it said about his state of mind, and who tried, in the limited time she had, to give him something better than an obsession. The holotape she recorded as a final message for him, the one that was supposed to play to welcome him after the war, is one of the more genuinely moving pieces of writing in the New Vegas DLC suite. It's a small human moment inside a location defined by the catastrophic scale of one man's inability to move forward. The courier enters the Sierra Madre stripped of their usual resources and essentially imprisoned by circumstances they didn't choose, which mirrors the thematic content directly. The DLC's design removes the player's accumulated gear and forces them to work with what they can scavenge from the hostile environment around them. This is uncomfortable in a specifically designed way. The Fallout player character is usually a figure of considerable power and resource. In Dead Money, that security is removed, and the player experiences the DLC the way its other characters experience the Sierra Madre, with less than they need, dependent on unreliable allies, unable to simply leave. The mechanical design is the argument. Dean Domino has been living in the villa for over 2 centuries, preserved by the same radiation that preserved the Sierra Madre, unable to leave because he believes the treasure is his path back to relevance and wealth and the kind of life he had before the war. He is a pre-war entertainer, a singer and con artist who was already working for pre-war criminals when the bombs fell, and his 2 centuries of isolation have not improved him. He is exactly as selfish and calculating as he was before the war, without the sophistication that context and society used to give his selfishness a veneer of charm. He's been stuck in the villa for 200 years, planning a score that no longer means anything in the world outside, certain that if he can just get what he came for, everything will be fine. He is the pure case study of what the DLC is about. A person for whom letting go is so far outside their cognitive framework that they've spent 2 centuries in a toxic ruin rather than accept that the thing they came for isn't worth what they're paying for it. Christine Royce carries a different form of trappedness. She was a Brotherhood of Steel scribe sent to find Elijah, who had been her mentor and had become, through his specific brand of obsessive ambition, someone who needed to be stopped. Her journey to the Sierra Madre involved a confrontation with Big Mountain's experimental technologies that resulted in significant cognitive and physical modification, leaving her unable to speak and filled with looping obsessive thoughts she can't articulate clearly enough to process. Her trap is internal. The trauma of what was done to her has organized itself inside her mind in a way that she can't fully access or address without help. Her arc in the DLC is about finding enough of a release from that internal trap to be able to choose what comes next. The ghost people, as enemies, work on both a mechanical and thematic level. They are difficult to kill because their suits make them resilient in conventional terms, but they can be dismembered, and dismemberment is what actually defeats them. The game requires the player to understand the enemy's specific nature and respond accordingly, which is a mechanical expression of the DLC's broader argument. Conventional approaches don't work in a place that is organized around keeping people trapped. You have to understand what's actually happening before you can address it. The treasure at the center of the Sierra Madre vault, which the player can reach at the DLC's conclusion, is gold bars. Genuine pre-war gold bars, extraordinarily heavy, in quantities that would make a person very wealthy by any pre-war standard. The problem is that they're almost impossible to carry out of the vault, given the player's encumbrance system. The game physically enacts the argument. The treasure you've fought through the entire DLC to reach is real, and you can have some of it, but you cannot take all of it, and trying to take more than you can carry means you cannot leave. The vault door will seal you inside. The treasure is real, and it will trap you if you want it too much. The DLC ends with the player walking out of the Sierra Madre with whatever they could carry, leaving the gold behind, the same way every obsession in the DLC ultimately has to be left behind by anyone who wants to actually leave. Section 24. The Courier's Past and the Lonesome Road. The Lonesome Road is the culmination of the New Vegas experience in a specific thematic sense. It is the moment when the game stops allowing the courier to move through the world as a relatively anonymous agent and insists on their personal history having consequences. The other DLCs are largely about places and other people's stories. The Lonesome Road is about the courier specifically, about what they did before the events of the base game, and about someone who was shaped by what the courier did and has been waiting ever since. Ulysses is one of the more carefully constructed presences in the franchise's history. He's referenced throughout New Vegas before the player ever encounters him. Mentioned by Joshua Graham, left traces in locations that suggest someone with a specific kind of ideology and a specific kind of grievance, described by various characters in ways that build a picture of someone unusual and purposeful. By the time the player finally encounters him in the Divide, they've had enough context to understand that this confrontation has been a long time coming and means something to Ulysses that they don't yet fully grasp. The Divide is the location that makes the confrontation possible and necessary. It was, before the events that destroyed it, a community called Hopeville, growing in the wasteland in a way that Ulysses believed represented something genuine and new. It was a place where people from different backgrounds were building something together, slowly but visibly, and Ulysses had invested hope in it precisely because it seemed like evidence that the wasteland could produce something other than the repetition of the old world's worst patterns. Then the courier delivered a package to Hopeville without knowing what it contained, and the detonators in that package activated the missiles buried under the area, and Hopeville became the Divide. A landscape of constant wind and radiation and structural collapse, the physical record of an instantaneous catastrophe. Ulysses spent years in the aftermath of that destruction deciding what to think about it. The courier didn't know what they were delivering. That's almost certainly true. But the courier's ignorance didn't prevent the destruction. The act and its consequences existed independently of the intention behind the act, and Ulysses, who had watched Hopeville die and who had survived only by chance, had to live with that fact while also trying to think clearly about what it meant. His conclusion, worked through over years of wandering and eventually of waiting in the Divide for the courier to come through, is nuanced in a way that might be surprising. He doesn't simply want revenge. He wants the courier to see what their action produced, to stand in the landscape their delivery created, and to acknowledge it with full knowledge. The Divide's physical environment makes this argument for Ulysses. Walking through it is walking through the consequence of a specific act. The ruined streets, the constant windstorm, the irradiated sinkholes, the marked men who were former soldiers caught in the detonation, their suits fused to their skin, their lives reduced to pain and aggression, are all evidence of what the detonator started. The environment isn't just hostile in the way Fallout environments are generally hostile. It's hostile in a specific, traceable way. This destruction has a cause, and the player's character is that cause. And the game makes the player feel that causal connection in every difficult, exhausting step through the Divide's landscape. Ulysses himself is someone who has thought more carefully about the Fallout world's political and historical situation than almost any other character in the franchise. His holotape messages, delivered throughout the Divide, lay out his analysis of the NCR, the Legion, and the old world symbols with a specificity and depth that's rare. He understands that the NCR is a reconstruction of pre-war American institutional patterns, which he finds both meaningful and troubling, because those patterns produced the world that ended. He understands that the Legion is a different kind of reconstruction, one that consciously rejects those patterns in favor of something older and in many ways more violent. He believes that the symbols of the old world, specifically the flags and insignia of the pre-war United States, carry something worth preserving even in the wasteland, not because the old country was good, but because those symbols represent a specific idea about human organization that hasn't yet been fully explored. That belief is the thing about Ulysses that makes him interesting rather than simply a damaged person with a grievance. He's a genuine idealist who has spent years thinking about what ideology can survive in the wasteland and what can't, and he's arrived at a set of conclusions that are coherent even if they're wrong in specific ways. His plan, to use the Divide's missiles to reshape the geopolitical landscape of the Mojave in ways that would force a reckoning with the question of what the surviving communities actually stand for, is the plan of someone who has decided that the current equilibrium is producing stagnation rather than progress, and that disruption is better than continuation. Whether that's right is exactly the kind of question New Vegas refuses to answer definitively. The player is given the choice to stop the launch or allow it to proceed in various configurations, and none of the resulting outcomes is unambiguously the correct one. The conversation between the courier and Ulysses at the Divide's end, if the player has made choices that lead to a non-violent resolution, is one of the franchise's better-written dialogues. Ulysses has been monologuing for hours through his holotapes, and when the player finally speaks with him in person, the conversation can become something more specific. Two people with a complicated history trying to figure out what that history requires of them now. The courier can acknowledge the Divide without claiming full moral responsibility for unknowing actions. Ulysses can acknowledge the difference between knowing and unknowing destruction without treating that distinction as full absolution. They can reach something that isn't reconciliation exactly, but is at least mutual recognition, which is not nothing in a world where most conflicts don't get resolved at all. Section 25. The Master's Plan and the Original Fallout's Moral Core. The Master is the primary antagonist of the original Fallout and one of the most philosophically developed villains in the franchise's history. He is grotesque in his physical presentation, a fusion of human tissue, computer systems, and FEV-modified organic matter that has expanded over years into something that is difficult to categorize as any single kind of thing. He occupies a pool of nutrients and technology in the cathedral beneath Los Angeles, connected to the systems around him in ways that blur the boundary between his body and his environment. He is also, beneath all of that, a person whose tragedy is specific and whose argument, considered seriously, contains positions that deserve actual engagement rather than simple dismissal. Richard Gray started as a wanderer in the early post-war period, someone exploring the devastated Southwest United States in the immediate decades after the Great War. His exposure to FEV at the Mariposa military base was accidental, and the transformation that followed was extended and agonizing in ways that the game's limited documentation suggests rather than fully depicts. What emerged from that transformation was a mind that had been expanded in specific ways while being altered in others, more capable in certain cognitive dimensions, less anchored to ordinary human perspective, increasingly aware of the irradiated world's long-term trajectory in ways that a purely human mind might struggle to hold. The Master's unity, his plan to convert all remaining human beings to super mutants, begins with an observation that isn't wrong. The human survivors of the Great War are in a genuinely precarious position. The ongoing radiation in the environment is damaging DNA across generations. Small, isolated communities face all the vulnerability to disease and violence that comes with small, isolated populations. The resources available to rebuild civilization are severely limited, and the competition for those resources is producing conflict that further reduces population. Left to their current trajectory, the Master genuinely believes human survivors will eventually die out. His super mutants, by contrast, are immune to radiation, disease-resistant, physically durable, and cognitively capable. They are, from a certain kind of cold calculation, a better species for the world that exists. The flaw in this reasoning, which the player can expose if their character has sufficient intelligence, is the infertility problem. Super mutants cannot reproduce sexually. The FEV transformation destroys reproductive capacity, along with everything else it changes. The only mechanism for creating more super mutants is to continue converting humans, which is a finite resource. If the Master's Unity succeeds completely, the resulting population is the last intelligent generation on Earth, present in significant numbers initially, but declining without any possibility of replacement until the last one dies and the world is left entirely without minds that can think about what comes next. When the Vault Dweller presents this argument to the Master and he processes it, what follows is one of the franchise's most remarkable moments. He doesn't argue back. He doesn't try to find a counter-argument or dismiss the problem. He accepts the analysis. He acknowledges that his plan was built on a fundamental error that cannot be corrected through any adjustment to its implementation. And then, in the game's original design, he uses his connection to the cathedral systems to destroy himself. The final boss of the original Fallout can be defeated without combat, through argument, through evidence, through the successful demonstration that the thing he was working toward would not accomplish what he believed it would. That's an expression of something close to faith and reason as a force in the world. The Master built something monstrous from a genuine attempt to solve a genuine problem. When confronted with clear evidence that his solution didn't actually solve the problem, he responded to that evidence rather than defending his position in the face of it. That makes him more human than a lot of the franchise's later villains, who tend to maintain their ideological commitments in the face of contradicting evidence, because their commitments have become too central to their identity to be surrendered. The Master was wrong, and he knew it when it was demonstrated, and he acted on that knowledge. There is something almost admirable in that, buried under all the horror of what he'd done to reach the moment of that recognition. The original Fallout's willingness to allow the player to engage the final antagonist philosophically, rather than simply combat them, reflects something about what the game thought it was trying to do. It was a game that believed moral complexity was worth taking seriously, that the question of what makes someone a villain was not simple, and that a plan built on genuine concern for the survival of intelligent life, however horrifically executed, deserved to be engaged on its own terms before being rejected. That orientation toward moral seriousness is part of what established the Fallout franchise as something more than a post-apocalyptic action game and gave it the depth of character that has sustained 30 years of fan engagement. Section 26. Unresolved Mysteries and the Deep Lore Frontier. Every Fallout game deliberately leaves some questions unanswered. The franchise has never been interested in total closure. Part of what sustains a living community of theorists and analysts around any long-running setting is the productive tension between what is known and what is only implied. And Fallout has managed that tension more skillfully than most comparable franchises over the course of its history. The Dunwich thread is perhaps the most sustained example of a mystery that the franchise has cultivated deliberately across multiple games and hasn't yet resolved. In Fallout 3, Dunwich appears as the name of a publishing company on a building in downtown DC, and as the name of a standalone location, Dunwich Building, that is clearly built to evoke Lovecraftian dread. The building has a specific atmosphere that sets it apart from ordinary ruined structures. Its lower levels contain evidence of pre-war occult activity, ritual spaces, inscriptions that suggest contact with something non-human and non-mechanical, and a specific kind of wrongness that the game constructs through its audio design and its layout, rather than through any explicit explanation. Players who investigate the building thoroughly come away with a strong impression that something genuinely supernatural was happening there, something that the franchise's usual materialist explanations don't quite account for. In Fallout 4, Dunwich Borers, the quarry location northeast of the Commonwealth, continues the thread. The quarry is an industrial site, but its lower levels, flooded and dark, contain the same quality of deliberate wrongness that Dunwich Building had, amplified. There are ritual circles. There are terminals from Dunwich executives who were clearly involved in something that went significantly beyond ordinary industrial operations. There is a specific vision sequence that the player character experiences at a certain depth in the quarry that is unlike anything else in the game. A genuine glimpse into a past that doesn't make sense in conventional terms. Something was here before the quarry. Something is still here. The game doesn't explain what it is, and that restraint is the right choice. Whatever the Dunwich entity is, it's more interesting as a persistent implication than it would be as a fully explained phenomenon. The alien presence established in Fallout 3's Mothership Zeta DLC is a different kind of unresolved question. The aliens who have been visiting Earth, apparently for thousands of years based on the evidence aboard the ship, represent a complete external system that the franchise introduced and then largely set aside. Their motives are not disclosed. Their relationship to the Great War is not established. Their relationship to any of the franchise's other mysteries, the Dunwich entity, the FEV's origins, the nature of the Glowing Sea's specific properties, has never been addressed. They exist in the franchise as a fact without explanation, which is both narratively frustrating and thematically appropriate. The pre-war world was complex enough that it could accommodate genuine alien contact as a background event, an extraordinary thing that happened and was classified, and was eventually submerged in the catastrophe of the Great War itself. The identity of who actually launched the first nuclear strikes in the Great War remains officially ambiguous. China and the United States had been in a state of escalating military conflict for years. The detonation of the first warheads could have been initiated by either side, or by some third party, or by accident, or by the actions of a small group of decision-makers who didn't represent the official position of any government. The franchise has shown glimpses of the moment of launch, the mushroom clouds rising over American cities, without identifying who pressed the first button. Some evidence, including certain enclave documents and various pre-war government communications, suggests the possibility that elements within the American government might have initiated a preemptive strike. If that's true, the implications for the franchise's broader political argument are significant. The civilization that claimed to be defending itself from external threat destroyed itself from within, which is a specific kind of tragedy that the franchise's pre-war world-building would fully support. The fate of other countries in the Fallout universe is another vast uncharted territory. The franchise is centered on North America, specifically the United States, because that's where the games take place. But the Great War was presumably global in its effects, and the 200-year history of every other country's post-war development is almost entirely undocumented. What did China look like after the exchange? Did any European nations survive in any organized form? What happened in the Southern Hemisphere, which might have been less directly targeted? The franchise has occasionally gestured toward this broader world through radio broadcasts and terminal entries that mention international events, but the full scope of what happened outside the United States remains one of the most genuinely open questions in the franchise's lore. The question of what Fallout 5 will be, where it will be set, and what questions it will address is one that the franchise community has been actively theorizing about since Fallout 4's release. Bethesda has confirmed it's in development, but realistic expectations around the studio's output timelines suggest it is years away. Speculation in the community focuses on several candidate regions. An Alaska setting would be extraordinarily rich in lore terms. The Anchorage campaign is one of the most significant events in the pre-war period, and the physical landscape of Alaska after 2 centuries of post-nuclear development would be genuinely unlike any setting the franchise has used before. A return to California, to the locations of the original games, would allow the franchise to show what those communities look like 2 centuries after Fallout and Fallout 2, potentially addressing the NCR's fate with more specificity than the television series has so far. An international setting would be the most radical departure and the most genuinely novel direction available. What the franchise will need to navigate in its next mainline entry is the relationship between the television series' canonical contributions and the game's established lore. The series has made specific choices about what happened to Shady Sands and the NCR, choices that have generated significant discussion in the community about whether they represent good storytelling decisions and how they affect the political arguments that New Vegas was building. A future game set on or near the West Coast will have to engage with those choices directly, which means either building on them or creating enough narrative distance that they're not central to the game's experience. The specific challenge of maintaining a coherent franchise lore across multiple creative teams working in different media simultaneously is one that the Fallout property shares with a small number of other long-running franchises, and how it handles that challenge in its next chapter will shape the franchise's narrative identity for the years that follow. Section 27. the smaller truths, details that change everything. The Fallout franchise is full of details that don't announce themselves, that sit quietly in environments or dialogue or lore documents until someone pays enough attention to find them, and that when found, change the way you understand something you thought you already understood. Collecting these details is one of the reasons the franchise retains its audience so effectively across decades. There is always something left to find. The pre-war relationship between Vault-Tec and the US government was clearly closer than the public was ever supposed to know. Various documents across the franchise established that Vault-Tec executives had access to classified military and government planning that would not have been available to a private company operating at arm's length from federal authority. The design of specific Vault experiments reflects knowledge of military research programs, FEV development, and strategic planning that Vault-Tec couldn't have accessed through normal channels. The implication is that Vault-Tec was not a contractor in any ordinary sense, but something closer to an operational arm of the government's most classified post-war continuity programs, working under corporate branding specifically so that the government could maintain plausible distance from the experiments being conducted. The Vaults were never a private enterprise. They were always a government program in a corporate mask. The Enclave's origins, traced back through the franchise's scattered documentary record, suggest an organization that predates the Great War by decades. The Enclave was not simply a collection of surviving government officials and military personnel who got together after the bombs fell and decided to maintain continuity. It was a continuity program that had been in development for years, carefully building the infrastructure and institutional frameworks that would allow it to function as a shadow government in the post-war period. The oil rig it occupied in Fallout 2 was prepared long before the Great War. The Raven Rock facility in Fallout 3 was built and stocked with the same pre-war foresight. The Enclave didn't emerge from the ruins. It had been waiting in the ruins before they were ruins, ready for the catastrophe that it may have had some role in causing. The FEV's origin in the Forced Evolutionary Virus Research Program is documented across multiple games, but its broader implications for the Fallout universe are rarely discussed comprehensively. The FEV was not developed as a weapon, at least not initially. It was developed as part of the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, a pre-war research initiative aimed at creating a universal immunity agent that would protect soldiers from biological warfare. The transformation from immunity research to the virus that creates super mutants and affects a significant percentage of the wasteland's unusual creatures is a story of research that escaped its original parameters in ways that the people running the program either couldn't anticipate or chose not to care about. The FEV is in the groundwater in some regions. It's affected the biology of animals across large geographic areas. It's been used deliberately by multiple organizations for purposes that diverge completely from anything resembling its original intent. The cascading consequences of a single pre-war research program constitute one of the most significant ongoing threads in the franchise's lore. The Pip-Boy's design and its in-universe history is something the franchise treats as background detail, but which rewards examination. The Pip-Boy 3000, the model used in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, was a commercial product manufactured by Robco Industries in the years before the Great War. It was sold to Vault-Tec for installation in vaults as a standard equipment item, and it was also available commercially, though at a price that would have made it accessible primarily to upper-middle-class and wealthy consumers. The fact that the device remained functional and readable 2 centuries after its manufacture reflects the pre-war world's commitment to extremely durable hardware, a commitment made possible by the same atomic power technology that made everything in that world both more capable and more dangerous than its real-world counterparts. The Pip-Boy's green screen interface, its chunky physical design, its vault door-shaped aesthetic are not simply nostalgic flourishes. They are accurate representations of what a device designed by that specific technological civilization would look like, atomic-powered, built to last centuries, and completely indifferent to the concept of elegant miniaturization. The Nuka-Cola Corporation's history in the pre-war world is one of the franchise's richest pieces of corporate world-building. Nuka-Cola was not simply a popular beverage. It was a cultural institution, a branding phenomenon that had penetrated American life so thoroughly that its imagery and aesthetic were inseparable from American identity in the pre-war period. The franchise's various Nuka-Cola flavors, revealed through DLC content and collectibles across the games, were each associated with specific marketing campaigns and specific regional identities. Nuka-Cola Quantum, which appears in Fallout 3 as a rare collectible, was a product that used a specific isotope in its recipe that made it glow blue in the dark, a detail that is simultaneously a perfect joke about pre-war America's cavalier attitude toward radioactive materials in consumer products and an accurate reflection of a period when the health effects of radiation exposure were not well understood or were actively suppressed. The relationship between the Nuka-Cola Corporation and the U.S. government appears in various documents to have been another example of the close corporate governmental relationships that characterized the pre-war world's power structure. Nuka-Cola facilities were among the most heavily produced industrial locations in the United States, which gave the corporation significant leverage over the government in terms of economic importance. The Nuka World DLC for Fallout 4 reveals a pre-war amusement park that reflects the full scope of Nuka-Cola's brand ambitions. Not just a beverage company, but a lifestyle company, a cultural presence, a vision of American optimism bottled and carbonated and sold by the gallon. Walking through the ruins of Nuka World is walking through the ruins of a corporate dream that was bigger than any single product, and that became, in the wasteland's strange archaeology, one of the more poignant monuments to what the pre-war world believed about itself. These smaller details, individually, might seem like nothing more than interesting flavor, but they accumulate into something substantial. The way the pre-war world connected its government to its corporations, its research to its military, its advertising to its self-mythology, the way those connections were hidden behind layers of plausible commercial activity is not background color. It's the central argument of the franchise made visible in 1,000 small ways. The Fallout universe is not dystopian in the sense of a deliberate authoritarian project. It's dystopian in the sense of a system that gradually optimized itself for the wrong things, and couldn't recognize what it was becoming until it was too late to change course. That's a more disturbing kind of dystopia, and a more honest one, because it doesn't require a villain giving a speech about their plans for domination. It just requires a lot of ordinary institutions making ordinary decisions that individually seem reasonable and collectively become catastrophic. If you made it this far, through all of it, the vaults and their cruelty and their occasional accidental kindness, the factions building civilization from violence and hoping the structure holds, the creatures carrying in their bodies the signature of a world that changed without warning, the music playing over ruins to an audience that didn't choose to survive but did, the small stories told in bones and terminal entries in pre-war newspapers that nobody alive can remember buying. Thank you. This is a world worth spending time in. Not because it's comfortable, but because it asks the right questions. What do institutions owe the people they claim to serve? What survives catastrophe? And what should? What does it mean to keep going when everything that gave the world its shape is gone? The Fallout franchise doesn't answer those questions cleanly. It sits with them, version after version, DLC after DLC, letting the wasteland be the place where the questions are visible in their full complexity. That's what keeps people coming back. That's what makes it worth 3 hours of your evening, or 100 hours of your year, or a decade of returning to it whenever the world feels like it needs that specific kind of honest examination. If you enjoyed spending this time in the wasteland with me, a like on this video helps other people find it. Subscribing means you'll be here for wherever we go next. Sleep well tonight,